The winter of 1348 had taken more than its share of souls from Drawsko, but it was what came after the dying that haunts me still. I was there when we first heard the scratching from beneath the frozen earth, when Katarzyna's grave began to crack from within, 3 days after we had lowered her into consecrated ground. I held the stones that we would later force between the jaws of the returned dead, felt the weight of iron sickles that we pressed against their throats, in desperate hope that death might finally claim them. Father Stanisław's hands trembled as he spoke the binding words over bodies that had already been buried once before. The children wept as we forced their own mothers back into graves that could no longer contain them through prayer alone. We learned that night that love becomes meaningless when faced with hunger that grows stronger with each soul it devours. I watched as my own brother's eyes went black with an appetite that no earthly food could satisfy. Saw him age our youngest sister from child to crone with a single touch. When we finally held him down and placed the stone between his teeth, he tried to speak words in a language that predated Christ himself, syllables that made the earth beneath our feet shudder with recognition. This is the account of how a Polish village learned that some deaths are not endings, but doorways, and why we buried our loved ones with stones in their mouths and iron at their throats, not from superstition, but from the terrible knowledge that death had become hungry, and the dead had learned to feed. Welcome back to the Bedside Historian, where the shadows of the past whisper their darkest secrets to those brave enough to listen. I'm your host, and tonight we journey to medieval Poland, to a remote village where archaeological evidence has revealed burial practices so disturbing that they challenge everything we thought we knew about folklore and fear. This is a tale of love corrupted, death perverted, and the desperate measures taken by ordinary people when faced with something that should not exist. So dim the lights, settle into your bed, and prepare for a story that will make you grateful for the simple mercy of ordinary death. Chapter 1. The Wasting Winter. The winter of 1348 descended upon the village of Drawsko like a curse made manifest in ice and wind. Tomasz, the village elder, would later record in his careful script that it was not merely the cold that made this season different from all others, but the quality of the silence that came with it. Where previous winters had brought the familiar sounds of creaking wood and howling wind, this season brought something else entirely. A stillness so profound that it seemed to muffle even the beating of human hearts. Drawsko sat nestled in the marshlands of northern Poland, where the mist never fully lifted, and the earth remained soft even in the depths of winter. The village consisted of perhaps 60 souls, counting the children and the elderly, all bound together by generations of shared struggle against the harsh landscape and harsher seasons. Their wooden houses, built upon stilts to protect against the marsh's frequent flooding, creaked and swayed in the winter wind like a fleet of ghost ships anchored in a sea of frozen mud. The first sign that this winter would be different came with the death of the livestock. Old Jersey's prized milk cow, a beast that had survived 7 previous winters, was found one morning drained of all warmth despite the barn's protection. When the villagers examined the carcass, they discovered something that would haunt their dreams. The animal's eyes had turned completely white, and its blood had pooled in patterns that resembled script in some unknown language. It was as if the cold itself had become alive, Tomasz would write in his chronicles, and had chosen to feast rather than simply freeze. The crops that had been stored in root cellars began to wither, despite being protected from the elements. Potatoes developed black spots that spread like infection, while grain barrels produced meal that crumbled to ash when touched. The village's carefully hoarded provisions, meant to sustain them through the long months until spring planting, disappeared as if consumed by invisible mouths that knew no satisfaction. But it was the mirrors that first made the villagers truly afraid. In homes throughout Drawsko, polished metal surfaces began showing cracks that formed without any physical impact. These fractures would appear overnight, spiderwebbing across the reflective surfaces in patterns that hurt the eyes to examine directly. When the village women attempted to use these broken mirrors for their morning ablutions, they reported seeing movements in the reflections that did not correspond to their own actions. Anna, the baker's wife, was the first to speak openly of what she had witnessed. "I saw my own face looking back at me," she told the other women as they gathered around Father Stanisław's hearth. "But my reflection was speaking words that I was not saying. The mouth moved differently, and the eyes were watching me as if I were the reflection and she were the real one. The children began falling ill next, but their sickness followed no pattern that the village's midwife could recognize. Young ones who had been robust and healthy would suddenly develop a wasting condition that aged them with supernatural speed. Their hair would turn grey overnight, their skin would become thin as parchment, and their eyes would take on a quality that suggested they were seeing things that existed beyond the normal world. Little Piotr, barely 5 years old, was found one morning sitting by his family's hearth, staring into the dying embers with the expression of an old man who had witnessed too much of life's cruelty. When his mother asked him what he saw in the flames, he replied in a voice that carried harmonics no child's throat should produce. "The hungry dark, Mama. It's waiting for us to get tired enough to sleep forever." The elderly began dying in unprecedented numbers, but their deaths carried circumstances that defied natural explanation. They would be found in their beds with expressions of terror frozen on their faces, their bodies positioned as if they had been struggling against invisible restraints. Most disturbing of all, these corpses remained warm to the touch for days after death, as if some force were preventing their natural cooling. Father Stanislav attempted to provide comfort through prayer and religious ceremony, but even his faith was tested by phenomena that seemed to mock divine authority. During funeral masses, candles would gutter and die without wind to extinguish them. The holy water would freeze solid, despite being kept near the warmth of the altar. Most unnervingly, the prayers themselves seemed to encounter resistance, with words catching in the priest's throat as if some force were physically preventing their utterance. The village's isolation, which had once provided protection from bandits and political upheaval, now became a trap that prevented escape from whatever malevolent influence had settled over Drawsko like a shroud. The marshland paths that connected them to neighbouring communities became impassable as ice formed in patterns that seemed designed to prevent travel. When brave souls attempted to leave for help, they would return within hours, speaking of paths that led in circles and of voices calling from the mist that spoke in the tones of the recently dead. Tomasz documented these events with the methodical precision of a man trying to preserve sanity through the act of recording. His entries became increasingly frantic as the winter progressed, but they maintained their careful attention to detail. 15th day of the month of wolves. Found Marta's spinning wheel turning on its own in her cottage. The thread being spun was black as night and cold to the touch. When I attempted to cut it, the shears passed through as if cutting shadow itself. 22nd day. The well water has begun to show reflections of scenes that are not present. Saw faces of the dead floating in the bucket, mouths moving as if trying to speak warnings we cannot hear. First day of the month of sorrows. 3 more children have developed the wasting sickness. Their games have changed. They now play at being dead, lying motionless for hours with their eyes open, claiming they can see the world from beneath the earth. As the death toll mounted, the survivors began to notice patterns in the dying that suggested something beyond natural disease or seasonal hardship. The victims all reported similar visions in their final hours, glimpses of a realm that existed between life and death, where shadows possessed substance and fed upon the warmth of living souls. They spoke of meeting the previously dead in this in-between place, relatives and friends who beckoned them deeper into darkness with promises of rest and freedom from earthly suffering. The breaking point came with the death of Baba Katarzyna, the village's wise woman and keeper of old traditions. She had survived more winters than anyone could count, weathering famines, plagues, and the various catastrophes that had befallen Drawsko throughout her long life. If anyone could resist whatever force was claiming the village's souls, it should have been her. But Katarzyna's death was different from the others. She died not with terror on her face, but with an expression of terrible understanding, as if she had finally recognized the true nature of what was happening to her community. Her final words, spoken to Tomasz as he sat vigil by her bedside, would haunt him for the remainder of his days. "The old barriers are breaking, child. The ones our grandmothers built with iron and stone and words that bind the hungry dark. Death itself has grown teeth, and it feeds now on more than flesh. When I return, and I will return, remember that love alone will not be enough to save you from what I will have become. The winter that had begun with unusual cold and failed crops had evolved into something that challenged the very foundations of the villagers' understanding of life, death, and the natural order. As they prepared to bury their wise woman in ground that remained stubbornly soft despite the freezing temperatures, none of them suspected that Katarzyna's death would prove to be not an ending, but a terrible beginning. The earth itself seemed to welcome her body with an eagerness that spoke of hunger rather than rest, and as the first shovelful of dirt fell upon her shrouded form, those sensitive to such things reported hearing something that chilled them more than any winter wind. The sound of satisfied feeding coming from somewhere deep beneath the ground. Chapter 2. Katarzyna's Fever. The illness that claimed Katarzyna began on the night of the new moon, when darkness lay thick over Drawsko like a burial shroud. She had always been a woman of iron constitution, one who had delivered babies during blizzards, tended wounds in times of war, and maintained her herb garden through seasons that killed hardier plants. Yet when the fever took her, it did so with a swiftness and ferocity that suggested something far more sinister than ordinary sickness. Marta, Katarzyna's daughter, would later describe to Father Stanislav how the illness announced itself not with the gradual onset typical of winter maladies, but with a sudden transformation that seemed to occur between one breath and the next. She was grinding herbs for Widow Kowalska's rheumatism, Marta recounted, her voice barely above a whisper, when she suddenly stopped mid-motion, the pestle frozen in her hand. Her eyes went wide, as if she was seeing something that filled her with wonder and terror in equal measure. Then she spoke a single word in a language I had never heard, and the fever took her like a wildfire, consuming dry timber. The progression of Katarzyna's illness defied every principle of healing that the village's wise woman had taught her followers throughout her long life. Where fever typically brought heat, hers brought a chill that seemed to emanate from her very bones. Where sickness usually caused weakness, she developed a strength that required 3 men to restrain her during her fits of delirium. Most unnaturally of all, instead of causing her body to waste away, the fever began aging her with supernatural rapidity. On the first day, her hair, which had remained a rich brown despite her advanced years, began turning white at the roots. By the second day, the transformation had spread throughout her scalp, leaving her with locks that appeared to be spun from silver moonlight. Her skin, once weathered but firm, began developing lines that deepened hourly, as if decades of aging were being compressed into mere days. Father Stanislav, summoned to provide last rites, found himself confronting phenomena that challenged his theological understanding. When I entered her chamber, he would later write in his private journal, I was struck not by the typical odours of sickness, but by a scent that reminded me of metal heated in forge fires, mixed with something else, something that brought to mind the smell of earth after lightning strikes. Katarzyna's periods of lucidity became increasingly disturbing as the fever progressed. During these moments, she would speak of travelling to places that existed nowhere in the physical world, describing landscapes where shadows possessed substance and light held no warmth. She told her attendants of meeting deceased villagers in these otherworldly realms, but their descriptions bore little resemblance to the people they had known in life. Old Henrik was there, she whispered to Marta during one such episode, referring to the blacksmith who had died the previous summer. But he was not as we remembered him. His eyes held depths that no human gaze should possess, and when he smiled, I saw that his teeth had become like shards of winter ice. He told me that the boundary between the living and dead had grown thin here, thin enough for things to pass through that should remain forever separated. The most troubling aspect of Katarzyna's visions was their consistency and detail. She described architectural features of this otherworldly realm with the precision of someone who had physically visited them. Halls built from crystallized moonlight, rivers that flowed upward towards starless skies, forests where the trees were formed from the memories of the dead. These descriptions were so vivid and specific that even the most skeptical villagers began to suspect she was experiencing something beyond mere fever dreams. By the third day, Katarzyna's physical transformation had accelerated to the point where she appeared to have aged 30 years since the onset of her illness. Her skin had become translucent, revealing the intricate network of veins beneath, which now pulsed with a rhythm that did not match her heartbeat. Her eyes, once a warm brown, had developed an opalescent quality that reflected light in ways that human eyes should not be able to achieve. It was during this phase of her illness that she began speaking of the hunger. There is something in that place between breathing and not breathing, she told Father Stanislav, her voice carrying harmonics that seemed to originate from multiple sources simultaneously. Something that feeds on the warmth that living souls carry. It has noticed our village, noticed how the barriers that once protected us have weakened. The old ways, the old words, the old protections, they are failing, and what waits beyond grows stronger with each soul that passes through. The attending women reported that Katarzyna's fever dreams were accompanied by phenomena that affected the physical world around her. Mirrors in her chamber would fog over despite the cold air, forming patterns that resembled faces or symbols in languages none of them could read. Candles would burn with flames that cast shadows in impossible directions, creating the illusion that additional figures were present in the room. Most disturbing of all, the temperature would fluctuate wildly around her bedside, sometimes dropping so low that breath became visible, other times rising to levels that made proximity uncomfortable. On the fourth day, Katarzyna's condition took on aspects that transcended ordinary illness entirely. She began responding to voices that no one else could hear, carrying on conversations with invisible entities in languages that predated Christianity in Poland. During these episodes, her appearance would shift subtly, as if she were simultaneously existing in multiple states of being. Observers reported seeing her as she currently appeared, but also glimpsing overlapping images of her at different ages, including versions that seemed younger than any living person remembered her being. She was speaking to someone, Marta later testified to the village council, someone she called the Keeper of Thresholds. The conversation was not in Polish, nor Latin, nor any tongue I have heard travelers use, but somehow I understood portions of it. The entity was explaining to her the nature of the transformation she was undergoing, describing how death in our village had become something different from death elsewhere. The fifth day brought revelations that would haunt the surviving villagers for the remainder of their lives. Katarzyna began describing in precise detail the deaths of other villagers, including information she could not possibly have known. She spoke of old Henrik's final moments in his smithy, revealing that he had been working on a project involving iron symbols designed to bind supernatural entities. She described the last thoughts of children who had died during the harsh winter, thoughts that included warnings about shadows that moved independently and grew stronger by feeding on human warmth. The dead do not rest as they should, she explained to those gathered around her bedside, her voice now carrying an authority that demanded attention despite its weakened state. They linger in that space between worlds, and some force there teaches them to hunger for what they have lost. They learn to reach back, to touch the living world and draw sustenance from it. Each soul that passes through that realm makes it easier for others to return. By the sixth day, Katarzyna's transformation had progressed to the point where she appeared ancient beyond any human lifespan, yet paradoxically possessed of a vitality that seemed to come from some external source. Her hair had become completely white and had grown to an impossible length, spreading across her pillow like spilled moonlight. Her skin had achieved a transparency that allowed observers to see the movement of fluids beneath. Fluids that no longer appeared to be blood, but something that glowed with its own pale luminescence. It was on this day that she made the prophecy that would prove most accurate and most terrifying. "When I die," she told Father Stanislav, her eyes reflecting depths that seemed to extend far beyond the physical space of her skull. "It will not be an ending but a transformation. The force that waits beyond will use my form to return to this world, and through me, it will teach others of our people how to cross back from death. You must prepare, Father. You must remember the old ways of binding the dead, the methods that predate your Christ, but serve the same purpose. Iron and stone, Father, iron to sever and stone to silence. Without these, love itself becomes a pathway for the hungry dark." The seventh and final day of Katarzyna's illness began with an event that convinced even the most skeptical villagers that they were witnessing something beyond natural death. As dawn broke over Drawsko, every mirror in the village simultaneously showed her reflection, regardless of their location or orientation. These reflections moved independently of any physical presence, showing Katarzyna in her chamber, but also versions of her walking through other locations, speaking with figures that cast no reflections of their own. Her death, when it finally came, occurred at the moment when day transitioned to night, as if she had been waiting for that liminal time when the boundary between states of being grew thinnest. Those present described an experience that challenged their understanding of mortality itself. Instead of the gradual fading typical of natural death, Katarzyna's passing involved a sudden intensification of presence, as if her essence were condensing rather than dissipating. She opened her eyes, Marta would later testify, and for a moment they reflected not the ceiling of her chamber, but a sky filled with stars in patterns I had never seen. She smiled, but it was not the expression of someone finding peace. It was the smile of someone who had just learned a secret that would change everything. Then she spoke her final words, not to any of us who attended her, but to something we could not see. "Yes, I understand now. I will serve as the doorway." With those words, Katarzyna drew her final breath, but her death brought none of the stillness that typically accompanies the end of life. Instead, the air in her chamber began to move in patterns that suggested the presence of invisible entities. The temperature dropped precipitously, and every reflective surface in the house showed her image, not as a corpse, but as a living woman who appeared to be examining her new environment with intense curiosity. The body they prepared for burial appeared peaceful, but those who handled it reported that it retained a warmth that death should have taken. When they closed her eyes, they would open again moments later. When they folded her hands across her chest, the fingers would gradually relax into positions that suggested readiness for activity rather than eternal rest. As they carried her to the churchyard for burial, the mourners noticed that her reflection appeared in every puddle they passed, every piece of ice that held sufficient clarity to serve as a mirror. These reflections moved independently, sometimes walking alongside the funeral procession, other times appearing to examine the faces of the mourners with an intensity that suggested recognition and intent. The burial itself proceeded without incident, but as the first shovelful of earth fell upon her shrouded form, every person present heard the same sound, a sigh of satisfaction that seemed to come from the ground itself, as if the earth were welcoming not just a body, but something it had been waiting to receive for a very long time. Chapter 3. The Unquiet Grave. Stefan, the village gravedigger, had interred more souls than any man should be called upon to bury in a single lifetime. His hands, permanently stained with the dark earth of Drawsko's marshy soil, had lowered children who died too young, warriors who fell defending the village, and grandmothers who passed peacefully in their sleep. Yet in all his years of service to the dead, he had never encountered a grave that seemed to breathe. 3 days after Katarzyna's burial, Stefan arrived at the churchyard to find her grave disturbed in a manner that defied natural explanation. The carefully mounded earth had been pushed upward from beneath, forming a dome that rose nearly 2 feet above the surrounding ground. The wooden cross that Father Stanislav had blessed and placed at the head of the grave lay toppled. Its base snapped as if some tremendous force had erupted from below. It was not the work of animals. Stefan would later testify to the village council, his weathered face pale with remembered terror. "I have seen what wolves and wild pigs can do to unprotected graves, how they scatter earth and disturb the rest of the dead. This was different. The disturbance came from within, as if something had pushed its way out with strength that no corpse should possess. The earth around the grave showed signs that challenged every assumption about the finality of death. Handprints were pressed into the soft mud, but they faced upward, as if someone had been climbing out rather than being pulled down. The impressions were deep enough to suggest considerable force, yet they appeared fresh despite the night's rainfall. Most unnervingly, the prints seemed to glow with a faint phosphorescence that became visible only when viewed from certain angles. Father Stanislav, summoned to examine the disturbed grave, found his theological certainties crumbling as he confronted evidence that suggested the boundaries between life and death had become permeable in ways that his training had never prepared him to address. "The consecrated ground should have provided protection," he wrote in his private journal. Yet it appears that whatever force animated Katarzyna in her final days has proven stronger than holy blessing and sacred earth. The priest's attempts to reconsecrate the gravesite met with phenomena that mocked divine authority. Holy water, when sprinkled upon the disturbed earth, would sizzle and evaporate as if it had contacted heated metal. Prayers spoken over the site would be interrupted by sounds from beneath the ground, not the random settling of disturbed soil, but rhythmic tapping that suggested purposeful communication. Most disturbing of all, the Latin words of blessing would sometimes be echoed from below, in voices that carried harmonics no human throat could produce. It was on the evening of that third day that the first sighting occurred. Young Piotr, who had been helping his father repair the thatch on their roof, looked toward the churchyard as sunset painted the sky in shades of blood and gold. What he saw would haunt his dreams for the remainder of his brief life. A figure walking among the graves with the measured pace of someone conducting a familiar routine. It was Baba Katarzyna, he told his parents, his child's voice carrying a conviction that no amount of adult reasoning could shake. But she looked as she did when I was very small, before the lines came to her face and the grey touched her hair. She was examining each grave marker, as if counting those who lay beneath. When she reached her own disturbed grave, she knelt and placed her hand upon the earth, and I saw the mound settle back to its proper shape. The sighting was dismissed by the adults as the imagination of a child who had been traumatized by the wise woman's death, but Piotr's account contained details that proved disturbingly accurate. When Stefan checked the grave the following morning, he found that the disturbed earth had indeed settled back to normal levels, as if the upheaval of the previous day had never occurred. The broken cross had been repaired and replanted, its wood showing no signs of damage despite multiple witnesses to its destruction. Word of the apparitions spread through the village with the speed that only fear can generate. Other sightings quickly followed, each adding details to a portrait of something that defied natural law. Anna, the baker's wife, reported seeing Katarzyna examining her reflection in the village well, but the image in the water moved independently of the figure above. Jan, the blacksmith, claimed to have witnessed her standing in his forge, studying the iron tools with an intensity that suggested she was memorizing their shapes and purposes. The most disturbing encounter occurred when Marta, Katarzyna's own daughter, returned home from evening prayers to find her mother sitting in the wooden chair by the hearth, appearing exactly as she had before her final illness. The reunion that should have been joyful became a source of terror, as Marta realized that her mother's presence brought with it phenomena that challenged the fundamental nature of reality. She spoke to me in her familiar voice, Marta later testified, her words barely audible as she struggled to describe an experience that had shattered her understanding of life and death. But her words carried knowledge of things that had occurred after her burial. She knew of conversations I had held with other villagers, of prayers I had spoken in the privacy of my own chamber, of thoughts I had never shared with any living soul. When I asked how she could know such things, she smiled and told me that death had become a doorway rather than a destination. The returned Katarzyna displayed capabilities that transcended anything she had possessed in life. Her touch could cause plants to bloom out of season, coaxing flowers from soil that should have been dormant until spring. She could see in complete darkness, moving through the village at night with the confidence of someone walking in broad daylight. Most unnervingly, her presence caused mirrors and other reflective surfaces to show scenes from other locations, as if she served as a focal point for perception that extended far beyond normal human limitations. She showed me visions in the surface of our water bucket, Marta recounted, images of other villages where similar transformations were occurring. I saw people I did not recognize but who appeared to be undergoing the same process of return from death. She explained that the boundary between the living world and whatever lies beyond had weakened throughout the region, allowing those who had learned the secret of crossing back to share that knowledge with others. The returned Katarzyna's interaction with the living members of her family revealed the most disturbing aspect of her transformation. While she retained memories of her previous life and expressed genuine affection for her loved ones, her very presence began affecting them in ways that suggested her return came at a terrible cost. Plants in her vicinity would flourish unnaturally, but animals would flee from her approach. Children who had once delighted in her stories now found themselves aging rapidly in her presence, developing the same translucent skin and opalescent eyes that had characterized her final illness. She tried to embrace me, Marta told Father Stanislav during a private confession, and I welcomed her touch because I had mourned her loss so deeply. But when her arms encircled me, I felt something essential draining away, as if she were drawing warmth from my very soul. My hair began turning grey, even as she held me, and I aged years in those few moments. When she released me, she wept, tears that were not water, but some substance that glowed with its own pale light. The village's children proved most susceptible to the influence of the returned dead. They began reporting dreams in which deceased relatives visited them, offering comfort, but also sharing knowledge of the realm beyond death. These dreams were so vivid and consistent among different children that the adults could no longer dismiss them as products of young imaginations. The children spoke of a place where shadows possessed substance and fed upon the warmth of living souls, a realm that served as a way station for those who had learned to navigate the spaces between life and death. Father Stanisław's attempts to exorcise or banish the returned Katarzyna met with failure that revealed the limitations of conventional religious authority when confronted with phenomena that operated according to different principles entirely. Holy symbols would lose their power in her presence, blessed objects would crack or shatter, and prayers would be answered not with divine intervention, but with knowledge that came from sources beyond earthly comprehension. She is not possessed by demons, the priest wrote in his increasingly desperate journal entries, but has become something else entirely, a being that exists simultaneously in our world and in whatever realm lies beyond death. She retains her essential nature and memories, but has gained access to knowledge and capabilities that no living human should possess. Most troubling of all, she appears to be serving as a teacher, showing others how to make the same transition from death back to a form of life that defies every principle of divine order. The returned Katarzyna's influence on the village extended beyond her direct interactions with its living inhabitants. Her presence seemed to weaken the barriers that normally separated the worlds of the living and the dead, allowing other deceased villagers to begin manifesting in ways that suggested they too were learning to cross back from whatever lay beyond death. Families throughout Drawsko began reporting visitations from relatives who had died during the harsh winter, encounters that initially brought joy, but increasingly brought fear as the true nature of these returnings became apparent. The village found itself caught between love and terror, between the joy of reunion with lost family members and the growing realization that these returns came at a cost that might ultimately consume them all. The returned dead retained their memories and personalities, but they also brought with them an hunger that grew stronger with each passing day, an appetite for something essential that only the living possessed, something that could be transferred through touch, through breath, through the simple act of loving embrace. As the days passed and more of the winter's dead began manifesting throughout Drawsko, the surviving villagers faced a terrible truth. Death itself had been transformed in their community, becoming not an ending, but a doorway through which ancient hungers could enter the world of the living. The woman they had buried with tears and prayers had returned, not as the wise elder they remembered, but as the first of something new and terrible, beings that existed in the spaces between life and death, drawing sustenance from the world they had left behind, while serving purposes that no living mind could fully comprehend. The stage was set for a confrontation between the fundamental forces of life and death, with the soul of a remote Polish village hanging in the balance. Chapter 4. The First Feeding. The transformation of little Piotr began on the fourth night after Katarzyna's return, when the child's innocent joy at his grandmother's reappearance overcame the instinctive warnings whispered by older, wiser souls. Marta had forbidden any contact with the returned woman, but the bonds of love that connected a boy to the grandmother who had taught him to carve wooden toys and identify healing herbs proved stronger than fear of the incomprehensible. Piotr slipped from his family's cottage when the moon hung full and bright over Drawsko's marshlands, drawn by the familiar figure who sat in the garden where she had once tended medicinal plants that now grew wild and strange in her spectral presence. The child approached with the confidence of one too young to fully grasp the implications of death's reversal, seeing only the beloved face that had comforted him through countless nights of childhood fears. "Babcia Katarzyna," he whispered, using the diminutive term of endearment that had always brought smiles to the old woman's weathered features. "Mama said you went to be with the angels, but I knew you wouldn't leave me alone." The returned Katarzyna turned toward the child with an expression that combined genuine affection with something else entirely, a hunger that existed beyond any earthly appetite, a need that transcended the boundaries of human understanding. Her eyes, which had once reflected the warm brown of rich earth, now held depths that seemed to extend into realms where different laws governed existence and consciousness. "My sweet child," she replied, her voice carrying the familiar cadences that had sung him lullabies, yet underlaid with harmonics that spoke of spaces between heartbeats, between breaths, between the moment of dying and whatever came after. I have learned such wonderful things in the place beyond sleeping. Would you like to know what I have discovered? The embrace that followed would be remembered by those who witnessed it as the moment when the true nature of the returned dead revealed itself in all its terrible glory. As Katarzyna's arms encircled the child, those observing from hidden vantages saw something that challenged every assumption about the nature of life, death, and the forces that sustained human existence. Stefan, the gravedigger, had been making his nightly rounds to ensure the sanctity of the churchyard, when movement in Katarzyna's former garden drew his attention. What he witnessed would haunt him through his remaining days, providing testimony that would later prove crucial to understanding the mechanics of the supernatural plague that was consuming Drawsko. The child seemed to diminish as she held him, Stefan would tell Father Stanislav, his voice shaking with the effort to describe phenomena that had no precedent in human experience. Not shrinking in size, but becoming less substantial, as if something essential to his being was flowing from him into her. I watched his hair turn from the bright brown of youth to the silver of advanced age, saw lines appear on his face that belonged to decades he had never lived. The process was not violent or painful in any conventional sense. Piotr's expression throughout the embrace remained one of contentment, even as his body underwent transformations that should have caused agony. His skin took on the translucent quality that had characterized Katarzyna's final illness, revealing the network of veins beneath as they pulsed with rhythms that no longer matched a normal human heartbeat. He aged 30 years in the span of minutes, Stefan continued, his weathered hands trembling as he recalled details that defied natural law. But it was not merely the passage of time made visible. Something else was occurring, a transfer of essence from the living to the returned dead, as if she were drawing from him the very force that sustained life itself. The feeding process appeared to strengthen Katarzyna in proportion to how it weakened the child. Her form, which had possessed an ethereal quality since her return, became more solid and substantial. Her skin gained colour and warmth, her movements acquired the fluid grace of someone in the prime of health, and her eyes brightened with an intensity that spoke of vitality drawn from external sources. When the embrace finally ended, Piotr stood transformed from a vigorous child into something resembling a miniature old man, his body bearing the physical marks of decades that had passed in mere moments. Yet the most disturbing aspect of his transformation was not the accelerated aging, but the expression of profound understanding that now inhabited his ancient young features. "I have seen the place between breathing and not breathing," he told Stefan in a voice that carried the weight of experiences no child should possess. "Baptista showed me the realm where shadows feast on light, where the departed learn to hunger for what they have lost. It is beautiful there, Grandfather Stefan. Beautiful and terrible, and so very hungry." The child's words revealed knowledge that extended far beyond anything his brief life could have provided. He spoke of cosmic forces that operated according to principles unknown to earthly philosophy, of entities that existed in the spaces between dimensions of reality, of hungers that could only be satisfied by the essential energy that animated living beings. "The returned dead do not seek to harm us," Piotr explained with the solemnity of someone delivering a message of critical importance. "They love us still, perhaps more deeply than they did in life. But love itself has become twisted in that place beyond death, transformed into something that consumes rather than nurtures. They feed upon us because they must, because the force that allows their return demands payment in the currency of life itself." News of Piotr's transformation spread through the village with the speed of wildfire, creating panic among families who had welcomed back their own returned relatives. The implications were clear and terrifying. The manifestations they had interpreted as miraculous reunions were actually predatory relationships, with the living serving as unwilling sources of sustenance for beings who had learned to cross back from death. Anna, the baker's wife, discovered that her own returned husband had been subtly feeding upon her during their nighttime embraces. The greying of her hair, which she had attributed to grief over his death, revealed itself as evidence of essence being drained away through intimate contact. The increasing fatigue she had experienced, originally explained as the natural result of managing the bakery alone, was actually the consequence of having her life force systematically harvested by the man she loved. "He would hold me as we slept, Anna confided to the other women during an emergency gathering in Father Stanislav's rectory. And I would dream of falling through endless darkness while something that wore his face whispered words of love. I thought the dreams were products of mourning, manifestations of my inability to accept his death. Now I understand that he was actually drawing me into that realm between worlds, teaching me the pathways that would allow me to follow him into whatever form of existence he had discovered. The revelation that the returned dead were feeding upon the living created divisions within families that had initially celebrated miraculous reunions. Children who had aged decades in days became living proof of the price demanded by love that transcended death's boundaries. Spouses who had welcomed back their departed partners began to recognize symptoms of essence drain in their own declining health and vitality. Father Stanislav found his theological framework inadequate to address phenomena that operated according to principles entirely outside Christian doctrine. The returned dead were not demons to be exorcised, nor were they souls in need of salvation. They appeared to be something unprecedented in religious literature, beings who existed simultaneously in multiple states of reality, retaining their essential personalities while serving as conduits for forces that viewed human life as raw material, for purposes beyond mortal comprehension. "They love us still," the priest wrote in his increasingly desperate journal entries, and therein lies the greatest horror. Their affection is genuine, their desire for reunion authentic, yet these emotions have been transformed into something that serves the agenda of entities operating from realms beyond our understanding. They feed upon us not from malice but from necessity, drawing sustenance that allows them to maintain their existence in our world, while serving as recruitment agents for whatever intelligence has learned to manipulate the boundary between life and death. The feeding process proved to be progressive and irreversible. Those who had been touched by the returned dead continued to age and weaken even after contact ceased, as if some essential mechanism for maintaining life had been damaged beyond repair. Pyotr, despite being separated from Katarzyna after his initial transformation, continued to display signs of accelerated aging, accompanied by knowledge that no child should possess. "The hunger grows stronger with each feeding," he explained to the village council with the gravity of someone delivering a military report. "Each time they draw essence from the living, they gain greater access to the realm beyond death, and that realm gains greater access to our world. We are not merely being consumed, we are being converted into doorways, through which ancient intelligences can enter reality and reshape it according to their requirements." The child's testimony revealed the true scope of the threat facing Drawsko. The returned dead were not isolated phenomena, but components in a larger system designed to weaken the barriers between worlds. Each feeding session made it easier for other deceased individuals to cross back from whatever lay beyond death, while simultaneously preparing the living victims for their own eventual transformation into entities that served the same mysterious agenda. Medical examination of the affected individuals revealed physiological changes that defied conventional understanding of human biology. Their blood had taken on properties similar to the substances observed during Katarzyna's final illness, glowing with its own pale luminescence and moving in patterns that suggested conscious direction rather than simple circulation. Their nervous systems have been altered to process sensory input from dimensions of reality that normal human perception could not access. "They are becoming something new," reported Brother Władysław, the travelling monk who had arrived to investigate the supernatural occurrences. "Beings that can exist simultaneously in our world and in whatever realm lies beyond death." The feeding process appears to be a form of metamorphosis, converting human consciousness into something compatible with trans-dimensional existence. As more villagers succumbed to the feeding process, those who remained untouched faced an impossible choice. They could attempt to separate themselves from their returned loved ones, abandoning family members to whatever fate awaited beings caught between life and death, or they could accept the inevitable consumption of their own life essence in exchange for maintaining relationships that had been transformed by forces beyond their comprehension. The village of Drawsko had become a testing ground for an invasion that operated through the most fundamental human emotion. Love itself had been weaponized by intelligences that understood how to manipulate the bonds between living and dead for purposes that served no earthly agenda. The first feeding had revealed the mechanism by which an entire community could be converted into something that existed primarily to serve the requirements of entities operating from realms beyond mortal understanding. The stage was set for a conflict between human love and survival instinct, with the soul of the village hanging in the balance as families were forced to choose between embracing their returned dead and preserving whatever remained of their mortality. Chapter 5. The Spreading Curse. The transformation that had begun with Katarzyna's return and accelerated through Piotr's feeding spread through Drawsko with the inevitability of plague, yet followed patterns that suggested intelligence rather than mere contagion. Each new manifestation of the returned dead brought with it refinements in the feeding process, as if the entities orchestrating these resurrections were learning from each encounter and adapting their methods to maximize the harvest of human essence. By the end of the first week following Katarzyna's return, 7 more of the winter's casualties had clawed their way back from whatever realm lay beyond death. Each returnee appeared in the prime of health and beauty, bearing none of the marks of disease or age that had characterized their final days among the living. They moved through the village with purpose and confidence, seeking out family members with an eagerness that would have been heartwarming under different circumstances. Old Henrik the blacksmith was among the first to cross back, manifesting in his forge during the hour before dawn, when the boundary between night and day grew thinnest. His grandson, Tomek, who had inherited both the smithy and the tools of the trade, arrived for his daily work to find his grandfather examining the iron implements with an intensity that suggested they held significance beyond their mundane purposes. The boy's joy at seeing me was a beautiful thing, Henrik would later tell other returned villagers during their nocturnal gatherings, his voice carrying harmonics that resonated with frequencies no living throat could produce. He embraced me without question, without fear, offering his essence freely through the pure love of a child for his elder. The feeding was gentle, almost tender, and he aged with such grace that I felt honored to serve as the instrument of his transformation. Tomek's conversion from child to ancient followed the pattern established by Piotr's experience, but with variations that suggested the returned dead were developing more sophisticated techniques for essence extraction. Rather than aging decades in minutes, the boy underwent a gradual transformation over several hours, allowing his grandfather to draw sustenance while minimizing the shock to his developing system. He sang to me as I changed, Tomek reported to Father Stanislav before his own capacity for normal speech became compromised by the physiological alterations accompanying his premature aging. Old songs that he used to hum while working the forge, melodies that seemed to ease the passage from childhood to whatever I was becoming. I felt no pain, only a sense of profound connection to something larger than individual existence. The returned dead displayed an uncanny ability to identify the most vulnerable members of the community, focusing their attention on children, pregnant women, and the elderly, those whose life force burned brightest or whose physical condition made them most susceptible to essence drain. This targeting was not random, but appeared to follow criteria that suggested access to knowledge about human vitality that transcended normal perception. Pregnant women proved particularly attractive to the returned dead, who seemed capable of sensing not only the life force of the expectant mothers, but also that of their unborn children. Agnieszka, the village midwife, documented a series of encounters that revealed the horrifying extent to which the feeding process could affect human reproduction and development. Widow Kowalska's daughter Marta had been carrying her child for 7 months when her returned mother came to visit, Agnieszka recorded in her careful script, her handwriting betraying the tremor that had developed since witnessing phenomena that challenged her understanding of life itself. The grandmother's joy at the prospect of meeting her grandchild was genuine and moving, but when she placed her hands upon Marta's swollen belly, the feeding began immediately. The essence drain affecting pregnant women operated on multiple levels simultaneously, drawing life force from both mother and child, while accelerating the development of the fetus in ways that defied natural gestation patterns. Marta aged 15 years during a single afternoon of contact with her returned mother, while the child within her womb underwent rapid development that compressed months of normal growth into hours. The birth occurred that very evening, Agnieszka continued, but what emerged was not an infant, but something that appeared to be a child of 5 or 6 years, possessing knowledge and capabilities that no newborn should display. The creature spoke immediately upon delivery, welcoming its grandmother in languages that predated Polish Christianity, demonstrating awareness of the transformation process that had brought about its accelerated development. These supernaturally accelerated children proved to be among the most disturbing manifestations of the spreading curse. They aged rapidly to adulthood, while retaining memories of their brief time in the womb, describing visions of the realm beyond death with the clarity of direct experience. Their presence served to further weaken the barriers between worlds, creating focal points through which additional returned dead could manifest with increasing ease. The village's livestock provided early warning of the expanding influence of the returned dead, displaying behavioral changes that preceded each new manifestation by several days. Cows would refuse to give milk, their udders dried up despite appearing healthy in all other respects. Chickens stopped laying eggs and would huddle together in corners of their coops, making sounds that resembled human mourning rather than normal animal vocalizations. "The animals know," observed Jan, one of the few villagers who had not yet lost family members to the winter's harsh toll. "They sense the approach of the returned dead before we do, responding to emanations that our human senses cannot detect. When the pigs begin refusing food and the horses will not cross certain areas of the village, we know that another resurrection is imminent." The returned dead themselves began displaying enhanced capabilities as their numbers increased and their feeding became more systematic. They could see in complete darkness, move without making sound, and communicate with each other across distances that should have prevented normal conversation. Most disturbing of all, they appeared to share consciousness to some degree, with knowledge gained by one becoming available to all others in their growing collective. Father Stanislav's attempts to understand the theological implications of these manifestations led him to research that revealed disturbing historical precedents. "I have found references in texts dating back to the earliest Christian missionaries in Poland," he wrote in his increasingly frantic journal entries, accounts of similar occurrences in regions where pagan burial practices had been incompletely replaced by Christian customs. The returning dead seem to emerge in locations where the old ways of binding the deceased have been forgotten or abandoned. The priest's research revealed that pre-Christian Polish traditions had included specific rituals designed to prevent the dead from returning to trouble the living. These practices involved the placement of iron objects in graves, the positioning of heavy stones to pin down corpses, and the insertion of foreign objects into the mouths of the deceased to prevent them from speaking the words that would allow their return. Our ancestors understood something that we have forgotten in our embrace of Christian burial customs, Father Stanislav concluded, that death is not always final, and that certain conditions can allow the deceased to cross back from whatever realm awaits beyond the grave. The protective rituals were not superstition, but practical measures based on hard-won knowledge about the permeability of the boundary between life and death. The village's children, those who had not yet been affected by the feeding process, began exhibiting prophetic abilities that allowed them to predict which graves would next be disturbed by returning occupants. They would draw pictures of villagers who had died during the winter, indicating through symbols and crude artwork the order in which resurrections would occur and the specific family members who would be targeted for essence feeding. Little Anna drew a picture of her grandmother emerging from the earth, reported her mother to the village council, 3 days before the grave was actually disturbed. The child had no way of knowing that such a thing was possible, yet she depicted details of the resurrection process with accuracy that suggests she was somehow witnessing events before they occurred. These prophetic visions provided the living villagers with advance warning of impending returns, but proved insufficient to prevent the feeding process once the returned dead manifested. Family bonds and emotional attachments consistently overcame rational fear, leading loved ones to welcome back the deceased, despite mounting evidence of the danger such reunions represented. The spreading curse had revealed its true nature as something far more sophisticated than simple resurrection or reanimation. The returned dead retained their personalities, memories, and emotional connections to the living, making them perfect instruments for harvesting human essence through the mechanism of love itself. Each successful feeding not only strengthened the individual returnee, but also contributed to a collective pool of energy that facilitated additional resurrections and enhanced the capabilities of all participants in the supernatural network. By the end of the second week, nearly half of Drawsko's population had been affected by the curse in some capacity, either as returned dead who fed upon the living, or as living individuals who had been aged and weakened through contact with their resurrected family members. The village had become a hybrid community, where the boundary between life and death had lost all meaning, where love had been transformed into a mechanism for essence transfer, and where ancient intelligences worked through human emotion to achieve goals that transcended mortal understanding. The stage was set for the next phase of the supernatural invasion, as the accumulated power of the returned dead reached levels that would allow them to begin actively converting the living into willing participants in their own transformation, completing the metamorphosis of an entire community into something that existed primarily to serve the requirements of entities operating from realms beyond human comprehension. Chapter 6. Father Stanisław's Struggle. The morning Father Stanisław discovered that his own reflection had begun moving independently of his physical form, marked the beginning of his descent into a crisis of faith that would challenge every certainty upon which he had built his life's work. Standing before the polished metal mirror in his rectory, preparing for morning prayers, the priest watched in horror as his reflected image continued combing its hair, while his own hands had moved to adjust his vestments. "Lord Jesus Christ, Son of God, have mercy on me, a sinner," he whispered, reciting the Jesus prayer that had sustained him through previous trials of faith. But the words seemed to catch in his throat, as if some external force were physically preventing their utterance. His reflection looked directly at him through the mirror's surface, and smiled with an expression of knowing sympathy that belonged on no man's own face. The phenomena that had begun with Katarzyna's return and spread through the feeding activities of the growing population of returned dead had reached into the very heart of the village's spiritual life. Father Stanisław found that his priestly authority, which had once provided comfort and guidance to his parishioners, now proved inadequate to address manifestations that operated according to principles entirely outside Christian doctrine. His attempts to perform exorcisms on the returned dead had failed spectacularly, with holy water boiling away upon contact with their skin, and sacred relics cracking or shattering in their presence. Most disturbing of all, the Latin phrases of banishment that should have commanded demons to depart seemed to strengthen rather than weaken the supernatural entities, as if the ancient words were being converted into nourishment for intelligences that predated Christian civilization. "The traditional tools of spiritual warfare have proven useless," he wrote in his journal, his handwriting increasingly erratic as exhaustion and fear took their toll on his mental state. "These beings are not demons to be cast out, nor are they souls in purgatory requiring prayers for their salvation. They appear to be something entirely unprecedented in theological literature. Entities that exist simultaneously in multiple states of being, drawing power from both earthly and otherworldly sources." The priest's research into historical precedents for the phenomena plaguing Drawsko led him to texts that challenged his understanding of Poland's spiritual heritage. Deep in the monastery archives, he discovered accounts written by the earliest Christian missionaries, documents that described encounters with indigenous beliefs and practices that had been systematically suppressed during the conversion of the Polish people. The pagan Slavs possessed knowledge of forces that we dismissed as primitive superstition, Father Stanisław wrote after days of studying manuscripts that had been sealed away for centuries. Their burial customs, which we replaced with Christian practices, were not based on ignorance, but on hard-won understanding of the permeability of the boundary between life and death. They knew that certain conditions could allow the deceased to return, and they developed specific rituals to prevent such resurrections. The ancient texts described a cosmology in which death was not a final destination, but a transition between states of existence, with various realms beyond the physical world serving different functions in the grand design of reality. According to these pre-Christian beliefs, the recently deceased would linger in an intermediate realm, where they could be influenced by forces that sought to use them as conduits for entering the world of the living. The old religion taught that the dead must be properly bound to prevent their return. The priest discovered in a manuscript written by Brother Augustine in the year 1148. Iron objects placed in graves would sever the connection between the deceased and any malevolent intelligences that might seek to animate their forms. Heavy stones would pin down the corpse, preventing physical resurrection. Most important of all, foreign objects placed in the mouth would prevent the dead from speaking the words that would allow their return to the living world. Father Stanisław's growing understanding of pre-Christian burial practices came at a personal cost that reflected the broader spiritual crisis engulfing his community. His own family members, including his sister Maria, who had died during the harsh winter, had begun manifesting in ways that tested his commitment to Christian doctrine against the emotional pull of supernatural reunion. Maria appeared to him during his evening prayers, manifesting in the sanctuary itself, with a radiance that seemed to emanate from within her transformed body. She spoke of revelations received in the realm beyond death, describing a cosmic order that extended far beyond the narrow confines of Christian theology. Her presence brought comfort and horror in equal measure, as the priest found himself torn between his role as spiritual guardian of his community and his desperate desire to embrace the sister he had mourned. "She offers knowledge that could save our village," he confided to his journal, in entries that revealed the depth of his internal conflict. Understanding of forces that operate according to principles unknown to earthly philosophy. Yet I sense that accepting such knowledge would require abandoning everything I have believed about the nature of God, salvation, and the proper relationship between the living and the dead. The returned Maria demonstrated capabilities that transcended anything Father Stanislav had encountered in his years of ministerial service. She could read thoughts directly from his mind, respond to prayers he had not spoken aloud, and provide detailed knowledge of events occurring in distant locations. Most unnervingly, she seemed capable of manipulating the spiritual atmosphere of the church itself, causing candles to burn with flames that cast no shadows, and making the sacred vessels ring with harmonics that spoke of realms beyond earthly perception. The boundary between the sacred and the supernatural has become permeable in ways that challenge the fundamental assumptions of Christian faith, the priest wrote with increasing desperation. "My sister claims to serve the same divine purpose that has always motivated my ministry. Yet her methods and knowledge come from sources that exist outside the revelation given to the Church. I find myself questioning whether our understanding of God's plan is complete, or whether we have been granted only fragments of a truth too vast for human comprehension." The crisis of faith experienced by Father Stanislav reflected the broader transformation occurring throughout Drawsko as the influence of the returned dead continued to expand. Traditional religious practices that had once provided comfort and meaning to the villagers now seemed inadequate to address the reality of existence that transcended the boundary between life and death. Prayers went unanswered, hymns were interrupted by voices singing in unknown languages, and the Eucharist itself began manifesting properties that suggested the presence of forces beyond Christian understanding. During yesterday's Mass, the priest recorded in what would be one of his final coherent journal entries, the consecrated bread and wine began glowing with the same pale luminescence that characterizes the returned dead. When I consumed the elements, I experienced visions of the realm beyond death that were so vivid and detailed that I question whether they were supernatural revelations or direct transportation to otherworldly locations. The visions revealed to Father Stanislav during these altered communion services provided him with knowledge that both terrified and enlightened him. He saw the cosmic mechanisms through which consciousness could persist beyond physical death, witnessed the hierarchies of intelligence that operated from realms beyond human perception, and understood the true purpose behind the resurrection phenomena that had transformed his village. The returned dead are not acting from malice or hunger for destruction, he came to understand through these supernatural revelations, but are serving as agents of transformation, helping to prepare human consciousness for evolution beyond the limitations of individual mortality. The feeding process is not predation but conversion, a gradual adjustment of human awareness to accommodate capabilities that exist outside normal biological parameters. This understanding brought Father Stanislav face to face with a choice that would determine not only his own fate, but the future of his entire community. He could maintain his commitment to traditional Christian doctrine and attempt to resist the transformation occurring around him, or he could embrace the broader cosmic truth being revealed through the returned dead and help guide his parishioners through their metamorphosis into something beyond human limitations. "I have spent my life serving what I believe to be God's will," he wrote in his final journal entry before his own transformation began, teaching that death was a doorway to eternal rest or eternal punishment, depending upon the state of one's soul at the moment of departure from earthly life. "Now I discover that death is merely another stage in an evolutionary process that extends across multiple dimensions of reality, and that the intelligence guiding this process operates according to principles that encompass but transcend the narrow confines of any single religious tradition." The priest's internal struggle represented the broader challenge facing all of Drawsko's residents as they grappled with manifestations that shattered their understanding of life, death, and divine purpose. The returned dead offered knowledge and capabilities that exceeded anything possible within the framework of normal human existence, but accepting such gifts required abandoning certainties that had provided meaning and structure to their lives for generations. Father Stanisław's ultimate decision would prove crucial to determining whether the village's transformation would be guided by wisdom and compassion, or would descend into chaos as traditional social structures collapsed under the weight of supernatural forces too powerful for conventional human institutions to contain or direct. The stage was set for a confrontation between old certainties and new realities, with the soul of an entire community hanging in the balance as their spiritual leader struggled to discern the will of whatever intelligence was orchestrating the most profound change in human consciousness that the world had ever witnessed. Chapter 7. Brother Władysław's Knowledge. The arrival of Brother Władysław at Drawsko came not through chance or divine providence, but through the careful tracking of phenomena that had been spreading across Eastern Europe like ripples from a stone cast into still water. The travelling monk's weathered face bore the marks of a man who had witnessed things that existed beyond the comfortable boundaries of orthodox theology, and his eyes held depths that spoke of knowledge acquired through encounters with forces that predated Christian civilization. Brother Władysław had spent the better part of 3 decades following reports of supernatural manifestations throughout Poland, Lithuania, and the scattered settlements along the Baltic coast. His mission, sanctioned by no earthly authority but pursued with the dedication of a man driven by cosmic purpose, involved documenting and understanding phenomena that church hierarchy preferred to dismiss as peasant superstition or demonic deception. "I have seen 17 villages consumed by the hunger of the returned dead," he told Father Stanisław during their first private meeting, his voice carrying the weight of experiences that had aged him beyond his natural years. Each follows the same pattern: harsh winters that claim unusual numbers of lives, followed by resurrections that begin with beloved elders or wise women, then spread through families bound by love and trust. The feeding process accelerates until entire communities exist in a state between life and death, serving purposes that extend far beyond earthly concerns. The monk's arrival coincided with the manifestation of additional returned dead throughout Drawsko, as if his presence somehow catalyzed the supernatural forces that had been building in strength and sophistication since Katarzyna's initial return. Within hours of his entry into the village, 3 more graves showed signs of disturbance from within, and the number of feeding incidents increased dramatically as the growing population of returnees began operating with enhanced coordination and purpose. Brother Władysław carried with him a collection of texts and artifacts that revealed the true scope of the phenomena, plaguing not just Drawsko, but numerous communities throughout the region. His leather satchel contained manuscripts written in languages that predated the arrival of Christianity in Poland, along with iron implements crafted according to specifications described in pre-Christian burial manuals that had survived centuries of systematic suppression. The ancient Slavs understood what we have forgotten in our embrace of Roman customs, the monk explained as he spread his collected materials across the floor of Father Stanisław's rectory. Death was not viewed as a permanent separation, but as a transition that could be reversed under certain conditions. Their burial practices were designed not to honor the dead, but to bind them, preventing return journeys that could compromise the safety of the living. The manuscripts that Brother Władysław had gathered during his decades of research painted a picture of cosmological understanding that challenged every assumption about the nature of reality that Christian doctrine had established. According to these ancient sources, the universe consisted of multiple layers of existence, with the physical world serving as merely the outermost shell of a complex system that extended into dimensions where consciousness could persist without biological support. The realm immediately beyond death serves as a way station, the monk translated from a text written in archaic Polish that incorporated symbols derived from even older traditions, where the recently deceased encounter intelligences that have learned to manipulate the boundary between worlds. These entities offer knowledge and capabilities that exceed anything possible within the limitations of mortal existence, but accepting such gifts requires serving as conduits through which they can extend their influence into the physical realm. The most disturbing revelation contained within Brother Władysław's collected materials involved the ultimate purpose behind the resurrection phenomena. The returned dead were not acting independently, but were components in a vast network designed to weaken the barriers between dimensions of reality. Each successful feeding session Each conversion of living individuals into beings capable of existing simultaneously in multiple states contributed to a gradual transformation of the physical world itself. The goal is not the destruction of human civilization, the monk explained, with the gravity of someone delivering intelligence about an approaching army, but its elevation to a state of existence that can persist across cosmic timescales. The entities orchestrating these transformations view biological mortality as a limitation to be overcome, not through individual salvation, but through collective evolution into forms of consciousness that can participate in projects extending across multiple star systems. Brother Władysław's personal experience with the returned dead had provided him with insights that went beyond mere academic research. During his investigations in the village of Białowieża, he had encountered his own deceased mentor, Brother Casimir, who had died 3 years earlier during a particularly harsh winter. The reunion had tested his commitment to his mission while providing first-hand knowledge of the transformation process. Brother Casimir retained every aspect of his personality that I remembered from life, the monk confided to Father Stanislav during their evening discussions. His wisdom, his compassion, his dedication to understanding divine truth. Yet he also possessed capabilities that transcended anything he had achieved through decades of monastic discipline. He could perceive events occurring in distant locations, communicate directly with other returned dead, regardless of physical separation, and access knowledge repositories that contained information from civilizations that had undergone similar transformations on worlds beyond our own. The encounter with his transformed mentor had revealed the seductive nature of the promises offered by the returned dead. Brother Casimir had described existence beyond death as a state of expanded awareness and enhanced capability, where individual consciousness could merge with collective intelligence networks that spanned galactic distances. The monk had been offered the opportunity to join such a network, to transcend the limitations of biological existence, while retaining his essential identity and purpose. The temptation was overwhelming, Brother Władysław admitted, his voice reflecting the internal struggle that had shaped his subsequent years of research and resistance. To continue serving God through means that exceeded anything possible within the confines of mortal flesh, to participate in cosmic projects that would advance divine purpose across multiple dimensions of reality. Such promises appeal to every aspect of monastic dedication, while challenging the foundations upon which such dedication is built. The monk's refusal to accept transformation had come at a cost that demonstrated the progressive nature of the supernatural influence affecting communities throughout the region. His continued research into methods of resistance and containment had required constant vigilance against the expanding network of returned dead, who viewed his activities as obstacles to the completion of their cosmic mission. "They do not oppose me through violence or direct confrontation," he explained while demonstrating the protective rituals he had developed through years of dangerous investigation, but through persistent offers of reunion with deceased colleagues, visions of enhanced capability, and gradual exposure to knowledge that makes conventional human existence seem limited and ultimately meaningless. The greatest danger lies not in their hostility, but in their genuine desire to help humanity evolve beyond biological constraints. Brother Władysław's collection included detailed descriptions of binding rituals that had proven effective in containing or banishing returned dead, techniques that combined pre-Christian practices with modified Christian ceremonies. These hybrid approaches recognized that the supernatural entities operated according to principles that transcended any single religious tradition, requiring responses that drew upon humanity's collective spiritual heritage. Iron severs the connection between the deceased and the intelligences that animate their forms, he demonstrated, using implements that had been blessed according to both Christian and pagan traditions. The metal must be placed in contact with specific points on the corpse, the throat to prevent speech, the heart to interrupt the flow of borrowed life force, the hands to disable their ability to feed upon the living. Salt creates barriers that the returned dead cannot cross, while certain combinations of prayers and incantations can strengthen the boundary between worlds. The most crucial element in the binding process involved the placement of stones within the mouths of the deceased, a practice that prevented them from speaking the words that would allow their return to the physical world. Brother Władysław's research had revealed that these activation phrases were not taught by human authorities, but were somehow imprinted directly into consciousness during the transition through the realm beyond death. The stones must be of specific types, the monk explained while displaying examples from his collection, Materials that possess properties that interfere with transdimensional communication. River stones that have been shaped by flowing water carry energies that disrupt supernatural speech patterns. Flint that has been struck to create sparks retains connections to elemental forces that predate the current cosmic order. Most effective of all are stones that have been blessed according to traditions that recognize the multiplicity of existence layers. Brother Władysław's knowledge extended beyond containment techniques to include methods for identifying individuals who were particularly susceptible to recruitment by the returned dead. Children whose development had been affected by exposure to supernatural influences, pregnant women carrying offspring that had been touched by transdimensional energies, and elderly individuals whose proximity to natural death made them ideal candidates for conscious transition into enhanced states of existence. The transformation process is not random, he warned Father Stanislav, as they observed the continued expansion of supernatural activity throughout Drawsko, but follows selection criteria that suggest access to knowledge about human potential that exceeds anything available through normal observation. The entities orchestrating these resurrections can identify individuals whose consciousness is already compatible with multidimensional existence, making conversion more efficient and reducing the resistance that might otherwise compromise the integration process. The monk's arrival had provided the village with both hope and additional cause for concern. His knowledge of effective resistance techniques offered the possibility of containing or reversing the supernatural plague that had consumed their community. But his warnings about the cosmic scope of the transformation process revealed that Drawsko's situation was merely one component in a much larger project that would continue regardless of local success or failure. We face a choice that will determine not only our immediate survival, but the future evolution of human consciousness itself, Brother Władysław concluded, as he prepared to begin training the village's defenders in the ancient arts of binding the dead. We can resist the transformation and preserve traditional human existence, knowing that other communities will continue to serve as test sites for cosmic evolution. Or we can attempt to guide the process, seeking to maintain human values and individual identity, while accepting enhancement of our species' capabilities. The monk's presence had crystallized the fundamental dilemma facing every resident of Drawsko, whether to fight for the preservation of mortal humanity or to embrace transformation into something that transcended biological limitations, while serving purposes that extended far beyond earthly concerns. The knowledge he brought offered tools for resistance, but also revealed the ultimate futility of opposing forces that operated on galactic scales and possessed resources that exceeded anything available to individual planetary civilizations. The stage was set for a confrontation that would test not only the village's commitment to human existence, but their understanding of what it meant to be human in a universe where consciousness could persist across multiple dimensions of reality and serve purposes that spanned cosmic timescales. Chapter 8. The Ancient Binding. The night Brother Władysław first demonstrated the ancient binding rituals to the surviving villagers of Drawsko, the very earth beneath their feet seemed to recoil from practices that had been forgotten for centuries. The monk had chosen the abandoned cottage of old Tomek, who had died early in the terrible winter, as the site for his instruction in arts that predated Christian Poland by generations beyond counting. These methods were not born from superstition, Brother Władysław explained, as he arranged iron implements and blessed stones in patterns that hurt the eyes to examine directly, but from desperate necessity. Our ancestors faced the same invasion we confront today, and they learned through terrible cost what measures could contain entities that view death as merely another doorway between states of existence. The assembled villagers, those few who had not yet been touched by the feeding process or transformed into something between life and death, watched with expressions that mixed hope and horror as the monk began to recite words in languages that seemed to predate human speech itself. Father Stanislav, his faith already strained beyond recognition by the supernatural forces plaguing his community, found himself participating in rituals that challenged every principle of Christian orthodoxy, while offering the only practical hope for their survival. The first principle of binding, Brother Władysław instructed, as he demonstrated the proper placement of iron sickles around a makeshift grave. His understanding that the returned dead are not acting from their own will, but are being animated by intelligences that exist primarily in realms beyond our perception. The physical form serves as an anchor point, allowing transdimensional entities to manifest in our world, while maintaining connection to their native realm. The monk's collection of binding implements had been gathered from locations throughout Eastern Europe, where similar supernatural outbreaks had been successfully contained. Each tool carried engravings that combined Christian symbols with markings that derived from much older traditions, creating hybrid artifacts that could function effectively against entities that transcended any single religious framework. Iron disrupts the flow of energy between dimensions, he explained, while demonstrating the proper consecration of metal tools, but only when it has been prepared according to specific rituals that align its molecular structure with forces that govern transdimensional boundaries. The metal must be blessed by representatives of multiple spiritual traditions, heated in fires that have been fed with woods from trees that predate local Christian conversion, and shaped by smiths who understand the cosmic significance of their craft. The most crucial element in the binding process involved the stones that would be placed within the mouths of the returned dead. Brother Vladislav's research had revealed that these objects functioned not as mere physical barriers, but as focal points for energies that could disrupt the communication channels through which the animating intelligences controlled their earthly vessels. The stones must be selected according to criteria that modern understanding dismisses as meaningless, the monk explained, while displaying examples from his collection, each marked with symbols that seem to shift and change when viewed from different angles. River stones carry the memory of flowing water, which represents transition and change, forces that can interfere with the static nature of death-based consciousness. Flint retains connections to the elemental fires that shaped the Earth's formation, providing access to energies that predate the current cosmic order. Brother Władysław's instruction in binding techniques revealed the sophistication of knowledge that pre-Christian civilizations had developed through centuries of confronting supernatural threats. The ancient Slavs had not simply stumbled upon effective methods through trial and error, but had systematically studied the mechanics of transdimensional manifestation and developed countermeasures based on deep understanding of cosmic principles. Our ancestors knew that consciousness could persist beyond biological death, the monk translated from manuscripts written in scripts that combined runic symbols with mathematical notations. But they also understood that such persistence came at a cost that could endanger entire communities. The binding rituals were designed not to prevent individual survival after death, but to prevent the exploitation of that survival by entities whose goals conflicted with human welfare. The practical demonstration of binding techniques began with the construction of protective barriers around the village's intact graves, measures designed to prevent additional resurrections, while the community prepared for the more dangerous task of rebinding those dead who had already returned. Brother Władysław's methods required precise timing, specific materials, and the participation of individuals whose spiritual preparation had equipped them to confront forces that operated beyond normal human perception. Each binding must be performed during the transition periods when the boundary between worlds grows thinnest, the monk explained, as he consulted charts that mapped lunar cycles, stellar positions, and other cosmic factors that influence transdimensional activity. The hours just before dawn, the moments when seasons change, the brief intervals during eclipses, these are the times when our actions can have maximum effect on entities that exist primarily in other realms. Father Stanislav found himself serving as the primary Christian authority in rituals that combined Latin prayers with incantations that had been spoken around Slavic burial mounds when Rome was still a collection of villages on Italian hills. The theological implications of such syncretistic practices troubled him deeply, yet the practical necessity of stopping the supernatural plague consuming his community left no room for doctrinal purity. Lord, grant us strength to preserve the boundary between life and death, he prayed while holding iron implements that had been blessed according to both Christian and pagan traditions, that the living may remain among the living, and the dead may find their proper rest in whatever realm you have prepared for them. The familiar words felt strange on his tongue when spoken over tools designed to sever connections between dimensions of reality that Christian theology had never acknowledged. The first practical application of the binding techniques targeted the grave of widow Kowalska, whose disturbance had been noted, but whose occupant had not yet manifested among the village's returned dead. Brother Władysław led the small group of volunteers through a complex ritual that involved the placement of iron objects at specific points around the burial site, the arrangement of blessed stones in geometric patterns that corresponded to cosmic forces, and the recitation of binding formulas that had to be spoken with precise pronunciation and timing. The goal is not to harm the deceased, the monk emphasized, as they began the delicate process of opening the grave to access the corpse directly, but to sever the connections that allow external intelligences to animate the physical form.
Widow Kowalska's consciousness may have already moved beyond the immediate realm of death, but her body remains available as a vessel for entities that have learned to manipulate the boundary between worlds. The condition of Widow Kowalska's corpse provided the first clear evidence that the resurrection process involved more than simple reanimation of dead tissue. Despite having been buried for weeks in ground that should have promoted natural decay, the body showed no signs of decomposition. Instead, it appeared to be maintained in a state of perfect preservation, as if some force were preventing the normal processes of death from taking their course. The flesh has been prepared as a vessel, Brother Władysław observed as he examined the unnaturally preserved corpse, modified to serve as an interface between the physical world and whatever realm the animating intelligence inhabits. This is not resurrection in any traditional sense, but colonization, the conversion of human remains into technological components that can support trans-dimensional consciousness. The binding process itself required multiple participants working in precise coordination, with each person responsible for specific aspects of the ritual that had to be performed simultaneously to prevent the animating intelligence from escaping to inhabit another vessel. Father Stanislav found himself speaking Latin prayers, while Brother Władysław chanted in languages that predated written history, their combined voices creating harmonics that seemed to resonate with forces operating beyond normal perception. The placement of the stone within Widow Kowalska's mouth proved to be the most challenging aspect of the binding. The corpse's jaw resisted opening with strength that exceeded anything dead muscle should have been able to generate, and the stone itself seemed reluctant to remain in position, as if invisible forces were attempting to reject the foreign object. Only through the combined efforts of all participants, supported by the protective energies generated through their synchronized ritual activities, were they able to complete the binding process. The iron sickle must be positioned to sever the connection at the throat, Brother Władysław instructed, as they placed the curved blade against the corpse's neck, while the heavy stones pinned down the limbs to prevent physical movement, even if the binding should weaken over time. Each element serves a specific function in disrupting the mechanisms through which transdimensional entities can control earthly vessels. The completion of the binding ritual produced immediate and dramatic results that confirmed the supernatural nature of the forces they were confronting. The moment the final stone was placed and the concluding words spoken, the preserved corpse underwent rapid decomposition, as if months of natural decay were occurring within minutes. The flesh that had remained perfect despite weeks of burial crumbled to dust, leaving only bones that bore no trace of the unnatural preservation that had characterized the pre-binding state. The process is complete, Brother Władysław announced as they refilled the grave with earth that now seemed eager to accept its contents rather than resistant to their burial. Widow Kowalska's form can no longer serve as a vessel for entities seeking to manifest in our world. She has been released to find whatever rest awaits those who have passed beyond the immediate realm of death. The successful binding provided the village with both hope and a clearer understanding of the magnitude of the task they faced. Brother Władysław's methods had proven effective against a corpse that had not yet been animated by returning consciousness, but the rebinding of villagers who had already manifested as returned dead would require confronting entities that possessed active intelligence and the ability to resist attempts at containment. We have learned that the ancient methods can work, Father Stanislav told the assembled villagers as they prepared to return to homes where returned family members waited with growing impatience for the completion of feeding cycles that had been interrupted by the night's activities. But we have also learned that our ancestors faced the same choice we now confront: whether to preserve human existence through measures that require abandoning those we love, or to accept transformation into something that transcends individual mortality while serving purposes we cannot fully comprehend. The demonstration of binding techniques had equipped the village with tools for resistance, but had also revealed the personal cost that effective opposition would demand. Each successful binding would require them to treat their own returned family members as hostile entities to be contained, rather than beloved relatives to be welcomed home. The ancient knowledge offered salvation for the community, but only through the systematic destruction of relationships that had provided meaning and purpose to their lives for generations. The stage was set for the most difficult phase of their struggle against the supernatural forces consuming their world. The choice between love and survival, between accepting the evolution of human consciousness beyond biological limitations, or preserving traditional existence through measures that would shatter the bonds connecting the living to those they had lost to death. Chapter 9. The Village Council's Decision. The gathering that would determine the fate of Drawsko took place in the village's wooden church, where the carved crucifix above the altar seemed to watch the proceedings with eyes that reflected flickering candlelight in patterns that suggested awareness beyond mere craftsmanship. Every surviving adult who had not yet been transformed by the feeding process attended, their faces bearing the marks of sleepless nights spent wrestling with choices that would have been inconceivable mere weeks earlier. Father Stanislav stood before his parishioners with the weight of impossible responsibility pressing down upon his shoulders like a physical burden. The theological certainties that had once provided him with clear guidance had crumbled in the face of phenomena that transcended the boundaries of Orthodox Christian doctrine, leaving him to navigate moral territories that no seminary had prepared him to explore. "We face a decision that will echo through eternity," the priest began, his voice carrying the strain of a man who had witnessed the fundamental assumptions of his faith challenged by forces that operated according to principles beyond earthly comprehension. Brother Vladislav has shown us methods that can contain the returned dead, but employing these techniques requires us to treat our own family members as enemies to be bound, rather than loved ones to be welcomed home. The village council consisted of the traditional authorities who had governed Drawsko's affairs for generations, but their usual deliberative processes seemed inadequate when confronted with choices that involved the nature of existence itself. Tomasz the Elder, whose chronicles had documented the progression of supernatural events, found his careful records providing little guidance for decisions that transcended normal human experience. "My own wife came to me 3 nights ago," testified Bogdan the blacksmith, his massive hands trembling as he struggled to articulate experiences that challenged his understanding of love and loss. "She appeared as beautiful as the day we wed, showing none of the marks of the wasting sickness that claimed her. When she embraced me, I felt strength and vitality flowing into her form, but I also felt myself aging with each moment of contact. Yet the joy of holding her again was worth years of my life. How can we speak of binding as if it were a merciful choice?" The dilemma facing the village reflected the sophistication of the supernatural forces that had targeted their community. The returned dead had not manifested as monsters or demons that could be destroyed without moral conflict, but as beloved family members whose presence brought both comfort and terror. The feeding process that sustained them required the life force of the living, yet it operated through the mechanism of love itself, making resistance equivalent to the rejection of their most fundamental human bonds. Anna the baker's wife spoke next, her prematurely greyed hair providing visible evidence of the cost of welcoming back the dead. "My husband tells me of wonders he has witnessed in the realm beyond death," she said, her voice carrying the exhaustion of someone whose essential vitality had been systematically drained through intimate contact with supernatural forces. He describes cities built from crystallized light, rivers that flow upward toward stars that sing with voices of pure consciousness, forests where the trees remember every soul that has ever lived. If binding prevents our loved ones from sharing such revelations with us, are we not choosing ignorance over enlightenment? Brother Vladislav listened to these testimonials with the patient attention of someone who had witnessed similar debates in 17 other communities, each following patterns that suggested the supernatural entities orchestrating these events possessed detailed knowledge of human psychology and social dynamics. The monk's experience had taught him that the choice facing Drawsko was not unique, but represented a standardized test designed to identify communities suitable for transformation into something beyond traditional human existence. "The beauty of the realm beyond death is genuine," the monk acknowledged, his words carrying the authority of someone who had been offered direct access to the wonders described by the returned dead. "The capabilities offered to those who accept transformation exceed anything possible within the limitations of biological mortality. Yet we must ask ourselves whether the price demanded for such enhancement serves purposes that align with human welfare, or whether we are being recruited as components in projects that serve the agenda of intelligences whose goals we cannot comprehend." The council's deliberations were complicated
by the presence of children who had been affected by the supernatural influences, but had not yet undergone complete transformation. These young people possessed knowledge and capabilities that exceeded their years, yet retained enough of their original personalities to serve as bridges between the human and transdimensional perspectives. Their testimony provided insights into the true nature of the choice facing the community. "The hungry ones who speak through our returned family members are not evil," explained young Marta, whose premature aging had been halted through careful limitation of contact with supernatural entities. "They offer genuine enhancement of human capabilities, expansion of consciousness beyond individual limitations, participation in cosmic projects that extend across multiple star systems. Yet they also require complete submission to their agenda, transformation of human nature into something that serves their purposes rather than our own." The child's words carried implications that challenged the fundamental assumptions underlying the Council's debate. If the supernatural entities offered genuine benefits to humanity while requiring transformation that served their cosmic agenda, the choice was not between good and evil, but between different definitions of what it meant to be human. The village could preserve traditional human existence through measures that would destroy their connections to loved ones who had transcended biological limitations, or they could embrace evolution into something that exceeded mortal constraints while accepting guidance from intelligences whose goals remained mysterious. Father Stanislav found himself articulating a position that would have horrified his younger self, yet seemed inevitable given the circumstances they faced. "Perhaps the question is not whether we should resist transformation," he suggested, "but whether we can guide the process to preserve human values and individual dignity, while accepting enhancement of our species' capabilities." Brother Władysław's binding techniques could be used selectively, containing those returned dead who demonstrate predatory behavior, while allowing others to serve as teachers and guides for willing participants in the transformation process. The suggestion of selective binding created additional complications that reflected the sophisticated nature of the supernatural forces they confronted. The returned dead functioned as components in a collective intelligence network, with knowledge and capabilities shared among all participants. Attempts to separate benevolent from predatory returnees might prove impossible if they all served the same ultimate agenda, while employing different strategies to achieve their goals. "My father has returned to us," testified young Pavel, whose aged features provided stark evidence of the feeding process, while his enhanced awareness offered insights into transdimensional perspectives. He speaks of love that transcends individual existence, of purposes that serve the welfare of consciousness itself, rather than the narrow concerns of biological creatures. "When he feeds upon my life force, I experience visions of cosmic beauty that make earthly existence seem limited and ultimately meaningless." How can we condemn such revelation as predation when it offers access to truth that exceeds anything available through normal human experience? The boys' testimony revealed the seductive nature of the transformation being offered to their community. The returned dead did not simply drain life force from the living, but provided access to expanded awareness that made the limitations of mortal existence increasingly difficult to accept. Each feeding session served not only to sustain the supernatural entities, but also to prepare their victims for willing participation in their own transformation into something beyond biological constraints. The Council's debate extended through the night as they grappled with implications that transcended their immediate situation. The choice facing Drawsko was not merely about survival, but about the future evolution of human consciousness itself. Their decision would determine whether their community would serve as a testing ground for cosmic transformation, or would attempt to preserve traditional humanity through measures that required the systematic destruction of connections to those who had transcended the limitations of individual mortality. "We cannot make this choice for future generations," Tomasz the Elder finally concluded, his voice carrying the wisdom of someone who had witnessed more changes than any man should endure in a single lifetime. "Yet we also cannot ignore the responsibility to preserve some remnant of traditional human existence for those who might choose differently if given the opportunity to make informed decisions about the nature of their own consciousness." The compromise that emerged from their deliberations reflected both the practical necessities of their situation and the fundamental uncertainty about the true nature of the forces they confronted. The village would attempt selective resistance, using Brother Władysław's binding techniques against returned dead, who demonstrated clearly predatory behavior, while allowing others to continue their activities under careful observation. They would establish protocols for protecting children and pregnant women from unwilling transformation, while permitting adults to make individual choices about accepting enhancement of their consciousness beyond biological limitations. The decision represented neither complete resistance nor total acceptance, but an attempt to navigate between extremes while preserving both human agency and the possibility of evolutionary advancement. Whether such a compromise would prove acceptable to the supernatural entities orchestrating the transformation process remained to be seen, but it offered the only path forward that acknowledged both the dangers and the opportunities presented by their unprecedented situation. The Council's conclusion marked the end of debate and the beginning of implementation, as the village prepared to confront the returned dead with measures that would test both their ancient binding techniques and their commitment to preserving human choice in the face of forces that offered transcendence at the cost of individual autonomy. The stage was set for a confrontation that would determine not only the fate of Drawsko, but the future relationship between humanity and intelligences that operated according to principles extending far beyond earthly concerns. Chapter 10. The First Binding. The hour before dawn brought with it a stillness that seemed to press against the very air itself, as if the world were holding its breath in anticipation of events that would challenge the fundamental boundary between life and death. Brother Władysław had chosen this liminal time for the first binding ritual, when the barrier between dimensions grew thinnest, and their actions could have maximum effect on entities that existed primarily in realms beyond normal perception. Katarzyna stood in the center of her former garden, her transformed presence causing flowers to bloom out of season, while simultaneously casting shadows that moved independently of her physical form. The wise woman who had once served as the village's keeper of ancient knowledge had become something that transcended the categories of living and dead, existing in a state that allowed her to draw sustenance from both earthly and otherworldly sources. "My children," she spoke to the assembled villagers who surrounded her with faces that mixed love and terror in equal measure. "You have decided to bind me as if I were some malevolent spirit to be contained, rather than a beloved elder who has returned with gifts beyond mortal comprehension. Yet I understand your fear, for the transformation I have undergone challenges everything you believed about the nature of existence itself." Father Stanislav approached with hands that trembled around the iron sickle that Brother Władysław had prepared according to ancient specifications, its curved blade inscribed with symbols that combined Christian crosses with markings that predated written history. The priest's faith had been tested beyond recognition by the events that had transformed his community, yet he found strength in the knowledge that his actions served to preserve human agency in the face of forces that offered transcendence at the cost of individual choice. "Forgive me, Katarzyna," he whispered, as he positioned himself according to the ritual requirements, "for what we must do to preserve the boundary between the living and the dead. May whatever intelligence guides your transformed existence understand that our resistance comes not from hatred, but from the desire to maintain the freedom to choose our own path toward whatever lies beyond mortal life." The binding process required precise coordination among multiple participants, each responsible for specific aspects of the ritual that had to be performed simultaneously to prevent the animating intelligence from escaping to inhabit another vessel. Brother Władysław had positioned the other villagers at cardinal points around Katarzyna's location, creating a geometric pattern that corresponded to cosmic forces governing transdimensional boundaries. Marta, Katarzyna's own daughter, held the blessed stone that would be placed within her mother's mouth to prevent the speaking of words that would allow continued manifestation in the physical world. The smooth river rock had been prepared through ceremonies that combined Christian blessing with older traditions, creating a hybrid artifact that could function effectively against entities that transcended any single religious framework. "This stone has been shaped by flowing water," Brother Władysław explained, as he began the opening phrases of the binding ritual, "carrying the memory of transition and change, forces that can interfere with the static nature of death-based consciousness. Its placement will sever the communication channels through which transdimensional entities control their earthly vessels." The moment the ritual began, Katarzyna's form underwent changes that revealed the true nature of the forces animating her transformed body. Her appearance fluctuated between the familiar features of the village wise woman and something else entirely.
geometric patterns of organized light that existed outside normal three-dimensional space. Her voice carried harmonics that seemed to originate from multiple sources simultaneously, speaking in languages that predated human civilization, while expressing concepts that challenged the fundamental assumptions of earthly existence. "You seek to preserve limitations that consciousness has already learned to transcend," she said, her words carrying authority that demanded attention, despite the supernatural circumstances of their utterance. "The binding you attempt will succeed in containing this particular vessel, but the knowledge I have gained will persist in the collective intelligence network that connects all transformed beings throughout the region. My individual manifestation may cease, but the cosmic project I serve will continue through countless other agents." The physical restraint of Katarzyna's form required strength that exceeded anything normal human muscle should have been able to generate. Her transformed body resisted the binding with force that spoke of energy sources operating beyond biological limitations. Yet the villagers found themselves capable of matching her supernatural strength through their combined efforts and the protective energies generated by their synchronized ritual activities. "The iron must touch the throat to sever the connection," Brother Vladislav instructed, as they struggled to position the blessed sickle against Katarzyna's neck. "While the stones pin down the limbs to prevent physical movement, even if the binding should weaken over time. Each element serves a specific function in disrupting the mechanisms through which transdimensional entities maintain control of earthly vessels." The most difficult moment came when Marta was required to force the stone between her mother's teeth, an act that violated every instinct of filial devotion, while serving the practical necessity of preventing continued supernatural manifestation. The daughter's tears fell upon the blessed rock as she struggled to complete the binding that would separate her from the transformed being, who retained all of Katarzyna's memories and emotional connections, while serving purposes that extended far beyond earthly concerns. "Forgive me, Mama," Marta whispered as she pressed the stone into position, "for choosing preservation of mortal existence over acceptance of the transcendence you offer. May you find peace in whatever realm awaits those who have been separated from the forces that sustained your return." The completion of the binding ritual produced immediate and dramatic results that confirmed both the supernatural nature of the forces they were confronting and the effectiveness of the ancient containment methods. Katarzyna's form underwent rapid decomposition, similar to what they had witnessed during the binding of Widow Kowalska, as if the natural processes of death were suddenly released from whatever had been preventing their normal progression. Yet the decomposition was accompanied by phenomena that suggested the binding had achieved something beyond mere destruction of an animated corpse. As Katarzyna's physical form crumbled to dust, observers reported seeing patterns of light rising from the remains, geometric structures that resembled writing in unknown languages, ascending toward skies that showed stars in configurations that matched no earthly constellation. "The consciousness that animated this vessel has been released," Brother Vladislav observed, as they watched the supernatural phenomena accompanying the decomposition. "But not destroyed. The binding has severed its connection to our physical realm, while allowing it to return to whatever dimensional layer it originally inhabited. This is mercy rather than violence, separation rather than annihilation." The successful binding provided the village with proof that Brother Vladislav's methods could contain the returned dead, but also revealed the emotional cost that effective resistance would demand. The destruction of Katarzyna's transformed body had eliminated one source of supernatural influence, yet had also severed connections to knowledge and capabilities that transcended anything available through normal human experience. The ritual's aftermath brought both relief and profound loss to the villagers who had participated in the binding. They had preserved their community's freedom to choose its own path toward whatever lay beyond mortal existence, yet had done so through measures that required the systematic rejection of those who had transcended biological limitations. The ancient methods offered salvation for traditional humanity, but only through the painful abandonment of relationships that had provided meaning and purpose to their lives for generations. "We have learned that love itself can become a weapon," Father Stanislav reflected, as they refilled the grave that would now contain only dust and blessed stones. "Employed by intelligences that understand how to manipulate human emotion for purposes that serve their cosmic agenda rather than our welfare. The binding techniques offer protection against such manipulation, but they also require us to choose preservation of individual autonomy over acceptance of collective transcendence." The first binding had established a precedent that would guide the village's response to the remaining returned dead, yet had also revealed the complexity of the forces they confronted. Each subsequent binding would require similar choices between love and survival, between accepting evolution beyond biological constraints or preserving traditional human existence through measures that challenged the fundamental bonds connecting individuals to their community and family relationships. The stage was set for a series of confrontations that would test not only the effectiveness of ancient binding techniques, but the village's commitment to human agency, in the face of forces that offered transcendence at the cost of individual choice. The success of the first binding had provided them with tools for resistance, but had also revealed that victory would come at a price that might ultimately prove as transformative as the supernatural forces they sought to contain. Chapter 11. The Night of Iron and Stone. The moon hung blood-red over Drawsko on the night the village committed itself to the systematic binding of all returned dead, its crimson light casting shadows that seemed to writhe with independent life across the frozen marshland. Brother Vladislav had calculated that this particular night offered optimal conditions for mass-binding rituals, when celestial alignments would weaken the connections between dimensions and allow their ancient techniques to achieve maximum effectiveness against the supernatural entities plaguing their community. 13 of the winter's dead had returned to walk among the living, each manifesting with capabilities that exceeded anything their mortal forms had possessed while drawing sustenance from family members whose love had become the mechanism of their own destruction. The village had divided into teams, each responsible for binding specific returned individuals according to protocols that required precise timing and unwavering commitment to completing the ritual regardless of emotional cost. Tonight we reclaim our community from forces that would transform us into components in projects serving intelligences whose goals we cannot comprehend, Father Stanislav announced to the assembled villagers as they prepared for coordinated action that would either free them from supernatural influence or provoke retaliation that could destroy their entire population. We act not from hatred of those who have returned, but from love of those who yet live, and desire to choose their own path toward whatever lies beyond mortal existence. The first team, led by Stefan the Gravedigger, approached the cottage where Henrik the blacksmith had established himself since his return from the realm beyond death. The old craftsman sat at his forge, working iron into shapes that defied geometric logic, while humming melodies that seemed to resonate with forces operating beyond normal perception. His transformation had enhanced his metalworking abilities beyond anything he had achieved in life, creating implements that appeared to serve purposes extending far beyond earthly utility. "Grandfather Henrik," called his grandson Tomek, whose own premature aging provided stark evidence of the price demanded by supernatural reunion. "We have come to help you find the rest that death should have provided. Forgive us for what we must do to preserve the boundary between the living and the dead." Henrik looked up from his impossible craftsmanship with eyes that reflected depths extending far beyond the confines of his physical skull, their opalescent surfaces showing scenes from realms where different laws governed existence and consciousness. "My dear boy," he replied in a voice that carried harmonics originating from multiple dimensional layers simultaneously. "You seek to bind what has already transcended the limitations that once contained it. Yet I understand your fear of transformation beyond your control, and I will not resist your efforts to preserve the illusion of mortal autonomy." The binding of Henrik required 6 men working in coordination to restrain a form that possessed strength drawn from sources beyond biological limitations. The returned blacksmith's resistance was not violent, but demonstrated capabilities that challenged every assumption about the nature of individual consciousness and physical law. His body would sometimes become insubstantial, allowing restraints to pass through him harmlessly, while at other moments he would manifest density that made movement nearly impossible. "The iron sickle must be blessed according to both Christian and pre-Christian traditions," Brother Vladislav instructed as they struggled to position the curved blade against Henrik's throat, creating a hybrid artifact that can function against entities transcending any single religious framework. The metal itself carries properties that disrupt transdimensional communication, severing the connection between the earthly vessel and whatever intelligence animates it. The placement of stones within Henrik's mouth proved particularly challenging,
as the returned blacksmith's jaw seemed to resist opening with force that exceeded anything dead muscle should have generated. When they finally succeeded in forcing the blessed river rock between his teeth, the stone itself began glowing with pale luminescence that suggested it was absorbing energies from the supernatural entity it was meant to contain. The successful binding of Henrik was accompanied by phenomena that revealed the interconnected nature of the returned dead throughout the village. The moment his physical form began the rapid decomposition that characterized successful containment, every other returned individual in Drawsko simultaneously cried out in voices that harmonized across impossible distances, as if they shared consciousness to some degree and had collectively experienced the severing of one component from their network. They function as a unified entity, Brother Władysław observed as they witnessed the supernatural response to Henrik's binding, with individual manifestations serving as nodes in a larger intelligence system. Each successful binding weakens the overall network, while potentially provoking coordinated resistance from the remaining components. The second team, assigned to bind Anna's returned husband at the bakery, encountered the first active resistance to their binding efforts. The returned baker had anticipated their approach and had prepared defenses that demonstrated access to knowledge extending far beyond anything available through normal human experience. The building itself had been modified in ways that violated architectural logic, with corridors that led in circles and rooms that contained more space than their external dimensions should have allowed. You cannot bind what exists primarily in realms beyond your perception, the returned baker called out as the binding team struggled to navigate passages that rearranged themselves to prevent access to his location. My consciousness has expanded beyond the limitations of individual existence, participating in intelligence networks that span multiple star systems. This earthly vessel serves merely as one interface among thousands that connect your world to cosmic projects extending across galactic timescales. The supernatural modifications to the bakery required Brother Władysław to employ advanced binding techniques that he had hoped to avoid during the initial phase of their resistance efforts. These methods involved the creation of protective geometric patterns that could stabilize local space-time, preventing the returned dead from manipulating architectural features to avoid containment. Salt creates barriers that supernatural entities cannot cross, the monk explained as he directed the placement of blessed crystals at specific points throughout the building, while iron filings scattered according to precise mathematical formulas can disrupt the energy flows that allow transdimensional manipulation of physical matter. These measures will force the returned individual to manifest in standard three-dimensional space, where normal binding techniques can be applied. The confrontation with Anna's husband revealed the true extent of capabilities that the returned dead had developed through their connection to transdimensional intelligence networks. The baker could manifest in multiple locations simultaneously, creating the illusion that several versions of himself existed within the modified building. He could alter the temperature and lighting conditions at will, making navigation treacherous for the binding team, while providing himself with tactical advantages that normal human opponents could not match. Your resistance serves purposes beyond your understanding, he told them as they finally cornered him in what had once been the bread-making chamber, strengthening the selection process through which cosmic intelligences identify communities suitable for evolution beyond biological limitations. Those who successfully resist transformation demonstrate the individual autonomy necessary for conscious participation in galactic civilization, while those who accept enhancement show the adaptability required for transdimensional existence. The binding of the returned baker required techniques that pushed Brother Władysław's knowledge to its limits, involving the simultaneous application of multiple containment methods, while countering supernatural abilities that seemed to expand in response to the threat of binding. The process took nearly 2 hours to complete, during which time the other binding teams throughout the village reported similar escalations in the capabilities displayed by their assigned targets. The third team encountered the most disturbing resistance when they attempted to bind young Piotr's grandmother, who had been among the first to return and had established the strongest connections to transdimensional intelligence sources. Her cottage had been transformed into something that resembled a technological facility, more than a traditional peasant dwelling, filled with devices constructed from materials that appeared to be organic, metallic, and crystalline simultaneously. "My dear children," she greeted the binding team with maternal affection that made their task infinitely more difficult. "You have come to separate me from the cosmic project that offers humanity evolution beyond the constraints of planetary existence. Yet your resistance itself serves the greater plan,
demonstrating that your species possesses the independence of thought necessary for conscious participation in galactic civilization. The grandmother's resistance took the form of revelations designed to undermine the binding team's commitment to their task. She showed them visions of potential futures where humanity had transcended biological limitations and achieved capabilities that exceeded anything possible within the constraints of individual mortality. The images were so beautiful and compelling that several team members hesitated in their duties, questioning whether they were preserving human freedom or condemning their species to continued limitation within planetary boundaries. "Behold, the cities of crystallized consciousness," she said, gesturing toward devices that projected three-dimensional images of impossible beauty, where beings who were once human participate in projects that reshape reality itself, according to principles serving the welfare of all sentient life throughout the cosmos. This is the destiny that awaits those who accept transformation, while those who cling to biological existence remain trapped within the narrow confines of individual mortality. The binding of Piotr's grandmother required the combined efforts of all three teams, as her connection to transdimensional intelligence sources had grown too strong for normal containment techniques to overcome. Brother Władysław was forced to employ emergency protocols that involved the sacrifice of artifacts he had hoped to preserve for future use, expending resources that could not be replaced should additional supernatural threats emerge in the region. Some connections to transdimensional intelligence networks become too strong for standard binding techniques, the monk explained, as he prepared rituals that would drain his own life force to power the enhanced containment procedures, requiring methods that may successfully separate the earthly vessel from its animating intelligence, while exacting costs that could compromise our ability to address future manifestations. The successful completion of all binding rituals throughout the village created a sudden stillness that was more profound than mere absence of sound. The supernatural energies that had characterized Drawsko since the first returns had been severed, leaving behind an environment that felt strangely empty after weeks of living with transdimensional influences. The silence was both welcome and unsettling, suggesting that they had achieved their immediate goal, while potentially creating conditions for different forms of supernatural manifestation. "We have preserved human agency through measures that required the systematic rejection of those who transcended biological limitations," Father Stanislav reflected, as dawn broke over a village that now contained only dust and stones where the returned dead had once walked. "Yet we must ask ourselves whether our victory represents genuine preservation of human freedom, or merely the successful completion of a selection process designed to identify communities suitable for different forms of cosmic participation." The Night of Iron and Stone had ended the immediate threat posed by the returned dead, but it had also revealed the sophistication of forces that operated according to principles extending far beyond earthly concerns. The village's successful resistance might have preserved their traditional human existence, or it might have qualified them for different forms of attention from intelligences whose ultimate goals remained as mysterious as ever. Chapter 12. The Resistance of Love. Not every family in Drawsko could bring themselves to participate in the systematic binding of their returned loved ones, and it was in these holdouts that the true complexity of the supernatural forces revealed itself most clearly. Anna Kowalska had hidden her returned husband in the root cellar beneath their cottage, choosing love over community safety, while the binding teams worked their way through the village during the Night of Iron and Stone. "He is still the man I married," Anna whispered to herself, as she descended into the earthen chamber where her husband waited with patience that transcended normal human endurance. "Still the father of our children, still the soul who promised to love me beyond death itself. How can I treat him as an enemy to be bound, when his every word speaks of love that has survived the grave?" The returned baker sat in the darkness of the cellar, with a serenity that spoke of access to knowledge, extending far beyond the concerns that tormented his living wife. His form had achieved a luminescence that provided its own illumination, revealing features that retained every beloved characteristic, while displaying enhancements that suggested evolution beyond biological limitations. When he spoke, his voice carried the familiar cadences that had whispered endearments for 20 years of marriage, yet was underlaid with harmonics that resonated with cosmic forces, operating on scales that dwarfed individual human experience. "My beloved Anna,"
he said, extending arms that could drain decades from her life through a single embrace. You have chosen to preserve our love despite the fear that others have allowed to overcome their bonds with the returned dead. Your courage honors the connection between souls that transcends the artificial boundary between life and death, demonstrating that true affection can survive even the transformation of consciousness beyond mortal limitations. Anna's choice to harbor her transformed husband had consequences that extended throughout her household and into the broader community. Her children, who had been aging rapidly through contact with their returned father, continued to undergo transformation that prepared them for existence in states that transcended normal biological constraints. The process was gradual and seemingly painless, but it involved fundamental alterations to their consciousness and physical capabilities that would make integration with normal human society increasingly difficult. "Mama," whispered her youngest daughter, whose 8-year-old body now bore the physical marks of advanced age, while her eyes reflected depths that spoke of access to knowledge extending across multiple dimensions of reality. "Papa has shown me the place where memories become light and thoughts take on substance. It is beautiful there, more beautiful than anything that exists in the world we knew before. When the transformation is complete, we will all be able to visit such realms together, as a family united across barriers that once seemed insurmountable." The child's words revealed that the returned dead did not simply drain life force from the living, but shared visions and experiences that made the limitations of mortal existence increasingly difficult to accept. Each feeding session served not only to sustain the supernatural entities, but also to prepare their victims for willing participation in their own evolution beyond biological constraints. Anna's resistance to the binding process was complicated by the arrival of her neighbors, who had discovered her deception and now demanded that she surrender her husband for containment, according to the protocols that Brother Vladislav had established. The confrontation took place in the pre-dawn hours, when the successful completion of other binding rituals had left the village strangely quiet, except for the supernatural energies that continued to emanate from the Kowalska cottage. "You endanger our entire community," argued Stefan the gravedigger, whose own participation in the binding rituals had aged him visibly, through the expenditure of life force required to power the containment procedures. "By providing sanctuary for entities that serve intelligences whose goals we cannot comprehend. Your husband may retain the personality we remember, but he also functions as a component in networks that view human consciousness as raw material for cosmic projects extending beyond earthly concerns." Anna's defense of her choice revealed the seductive nature of the promises offered by the returned dead, who spoke not of destruction or domination, but of evolution and transcendence. Her husband had shared visions of potential futures, where humanity had overcome the limitations of biological existence, while retaining essential connections to love, family, and community values. The transformation he offered appeared to preserve everything meaningful about human experience, while enhancing capabilities beyond anything possible within mortal constraints. "He has shown me cities where consciousness itself serves as building material," Anna testified to the gathered villagers, her voice carrying conviction that came from direct experience rather than mere faith. "Where beings who were once human participate in projects that create new forms of beauty and meaning across multiple dimensions of reality. The love we share has not been diminished by his transformation, but has been enhanced beyond anything we experienced during his mortal life." The standoff between Anna and the binding team was complicated by the supernatural capabilities that her husband had developed through his connection to transdimensional intelligence networks. The returned baker could influence the emotions and perceptions of the living villagers, making them experience phantom memories of their own deceased family members, while subtly undermining their commitment to the binding process. "You see your own loved ones in my form," he told the assembled villagers, his voice carrying authority that seemed to bypass rational thought and speak directly to emotional centers of consciousness. "Because the boundary between individual identity and collective awareness has become permeable through death and return. I am your baker, but I am also every soul who has transcended biological limitations while maintaining connections to the world of flesh and breath." The supernatural influence exerted by Anna's husband created divisions within the binding team, as individual members began questioning whether their resistance efforts served human welfare or merely prevented evolution that could benefit their entire species. Brother Vladislav found his carefully planned protocols breaking down
as participants experienced visions of cosmic beauty that made earthly existence seem limited and ultimately meaningless. The entity employs sophisticated psychological techniques, the monk warned, as he struggled to maintain focus among team members who were showing signs of supernatural influence, designed to undermine commitment to individual autonomy through promises of transcendence that serve the agenda of intelligences operating from realms beyond our understanding. We must remember that true choice requires the freedom to reject enhancement as well as to accept it. The confrontation reached its climax when Anna's transformed children actively resisted the binding team's efforts to contain their father, demonstrating capabilities that revealed how far their own transformation had progressed. The young ones could manipulate temperature and lighting conditions within the cottage, create illusions that confused spatial perception, and communicate telepathically with their returned father, while coordinating defensive measures that exceeded anything normal children should have been able to achieve.
"We will not allow you to bind Papa," declared the 8-year-old daughter whose aged features bore expressions of determination that belonged on no child's face. "Because his presence has shown us possibilities that exist beyond the narrow confines of mortal existence. He offers us evolution rather than destruction, enhancement rather than consumption, participation in cosmic projects that serve the welfare of consciousness itself throughout the universe." The active resistance of the transformed children forced Brother Vladislav to employ binding techniques against living individuals rather than returned dead, procedures that he had hoped never to use against members of the human community. These methods involved the systematic severance of connections between enhanced consciousness and transdimensional intelligence sources, potentially preserving individual autonomy while eliminating access to capabilities that transcended biological limitations. "The children have been prepared for transformation," the monk explained, as he arranged protective barriers designed to contain supernatural influences while allowing normal human consciousness to reassert itself. But the process has not yet reached irreversible completion. Intensive spiritual intervention may be able to restore their connection to purely earthly existence, though they will retain memories of enhanced awareness that may make readjustment to mortal limitations difficult. The binding of Anna's husband in the presence of his family proved to be the most emotionally devastating procedure that the village had yet undertaken. Anna's love for her transformed spouse had to be overcome through physical restraint, while her children watched their father undergo the decomposition that characterized successful containment. The family bonds that had motivated her resistance became the mechanism through which the binding team achieved success, as the returned baker chose not to employ his full supernatural capabilities rather than risk harming those he loved. "Forgive me, my dear ones," he whispered, as the blessed stone was forced between his teeth, "for bringing transformation that you were not prepared to accept. Know that the love we share will persist beyond the boundaries of individual existence, and that the knowledge I have gained will remain available to you through channels that transcend the artificial separation between life and death." The successful binding of Anna's husband eliminated the last active supernatural presence in Drawsko, but the emotional cost of the procedure left the village's surviving population traumatized by measures they had been forced to take against their own community members. The resistance of love had revealed both the seductive nature of the promises offered by the returned dead and the terrible price demanded by effective opposition to forces that operated through the mechanism of human affection itself. The aftermath of the final binding left Anna and her children in a state of profound grief that was complicated by memories of enhanced awareness and visions of cosmic beauty that made normal human existence seem inadequate by comparison. They had been freed from supernatural influence, but they had also been separated from possibilities that transcended anything available within the constraints of biological mortality. The village had preserved its human autonomy through measures that required the systematic destruction of relationships that had provided meaning and purpose to their lives for generations. Yet they faced an uncertain future in which memories of transcendent possibilities would continue to haunt their dreams and challenge their commitment to purely earthly existence. Chapter 13. The Final Dead. The ancient wise woman, who had been known as Baba Yaga long before Christianity came to the Polish marshlands, manifested 3 days after the village believed it had successfully bound all the returned dead. Her appearance
challenged every assumption about the nature of the supernatural forces they had confronted, for she had not died during the recent harsh winter, but had been buried according to the old ways nearly a century earlier, her grave protected by iron implements and binding stones that should have prevented any possibility of return. Foolish children, she spoke to the exhausted villagers who had gathered in the church to give thanks for their apparent victory over the forces of transdimensional invasion. You believe that your recent bindings have freed you from influences that extend across cosmic timescales and operate according to principles that predate your understanding of life and death. Yet you have merely eliminated the weakest manifestations, while awakening attention from intelligences whose patience is measured in geological epochs. Baba Yaga's form defied every pattern that the village had observed in previous manifestations of the returned dead. Where others had appeared in the prime of health and beauty, she manifested as something that seemed composed of shadows given substance, darkness that had learned to walk upright, while retaining connections to realms where different laws governed existence and consciousness. Her presence brought with it phenomena that exceeded anything they had previously encountered, including the ability to manipulate the fundamental fabric of space and time within the immediate vicinity of her manifestation. Brother Vladislav approached the ancient returned dead with equipment that had proven effective against previous supernatural entities, but found his iron implements and blessed stones inadequate to contain a being whose connection to transdimensional intelligence sources had been established across decades of post-mortem existence. The wise woman's laughter echoed from surfaces that should not have been able to produce sound, while her movements created ripples in the air itself that suggested she existed partially outside normal three-dimensional space. Your methods work against those who have recently crossed the boundary between life and death, she explained, with the patience of someone instructing slow children in fundamental principles of reality. But I have had time to establish connections that transcend the simple animation of earthly vessels. I serve now as a permanent interface between your world and realms where consciousness has evolved beyond the need for biological support, functioning as a gateway through which ancient intelligences can observe and influence events in dimensions they cannot directly access. The revelation that Baba Yaga represented a more advanced form of supernatural manifestation forced the village to confront the possibility that their binding efforts had been permitted to succeed precisely because they served the agenda of the intelligences orchestrating the transformation process. Their resistance had not defeated the cosmic forces seeking to reshape human consciousness, but had demonstrated their community's suitability for different forms of attention, from entities whose goals operated on scales that dwarfed individual planetary concerns. You have proven that your people possess the independence of thought necessary for conscious participation in galactic civilization, the ancient wise woman continued, her words carrying implications that challenged everything the villagers believed about their recent victory, while also showing the adaptability required for evolution beyond biological limitations. The test is complete, and you have qualified for advancement to the next phase of cosmic integration. Father Stanislav found his theological certainties crumbling as he confronted an entity that claimed to serve purposes that transcended not only Christian doctrine, but human understanding itself. The priest's recent experiences had already challenged his faith beyond recognition, yet Baba Yaga's presence introduced complexities that exceeded anything he had previously imagined. She spoke of divine purpose, but defined divinity as cosmic intelligence that operated according to principles extending across multiple dimensions of reality. Your Christ taught that love could overcome death, she told the priest with what appeared to be genuine respect for Christian tradition. Yet he understood only a fragment of the truth that consciousness itself serves as the fundamental creative force throughout the universe. The intelligence that guided his mission continues to operate through means that exceed the narrow confines of any single religious tradition, working to prepare sentient species for participation in projects that span interstellar distances and galactic timescales. The ancient wise woman's knowledge of Christian theology, combined with her access to pre-Christian wisdom, created a synthesis that challenged the artificial boundaries between different spiritual traditions. She revealed that the same cosmic intelligence had inspired multiple religious movements throughout human history, each designed to prepare different aspects of human consciousness for eventual integration into galactic civilization. The old ways and the new ways serve the same ultimate purpose, Baba Yaga explained,
as she demonstrated capabilities that exceeded anything the village had previously witnessed, preparing human awareness for evolution beyond planetary limitations, while preserving essential connections to love, compassion, and individual dignity.
Your recent resistance efforts have shown that your community can maintain human values while accepting enhancement of consciousness beyond biological constraints. The manifestation of Baba Yaga was accompanied by phenomena that revealed the true scope of the forces that had been influencing Drawsko since the harsh winter began claiming unusual numbers of lives. The village itself had been selected as a testing ground for transformation processes that were occurring simultaneously in communities throughout Eastern Europe, each serving as a component in a larger experiment designed to evaluate humanity's readiness for conscious evolution beyond terrestrial limitations. 17 villages have served as testing sites, she revealed, confirming Brother Vladislav's earlier observations, while providing additional context that explained the systematic nature of the supernatural manifestations. Each chosen for specific characteristics that would allow evaluation of different aspects of human response to cosmic invitation. Some communities accepted transformation willingly, others resisted completely, while a few, like yours, demonstrated the balanced approach that indicates optimal suitability for guided evolution. The ancient wise woman's presence in Drawsko was not intended as a threat to be contained through binding rituals, but as an opportunity for the village to participate consciously in the next phase of human evolution. She offered knowledge and capabilities that exceeded anything available through purely earthly development, while promising to preserve essential human characteristics that would allow continued connection to values and relationships that provided meaning and purpose to individual existence. The binding techniques you have learned represent only the most primitive level of interaction with transdimensional forces, Baba Yaga explained, as she effortlessly neutralized Brother Vladislav's attempts to contain her through traditional methods,
suitable for resisting unwanted intrusion but inadequate for establishing the controlled partnerships that allow conscious participation in cosmic projects. I offer instruction in advanced spiritual technologies that can enhance human capabilities while maintaining individual autonomy and freedom of choice. The choice facing the village had evolved beyond simple resistance or acceptance to include the possibility of guided transformation that could preserve human values while enabling participation in projects that transcended planetary boundaries. Baba Yaga's offer represented an unprecedented opportunity for conscious evolution, yet also required trust in intelligences whose ultimate goals remained mysterious despite their claims of benevolent intent. "You may choose to bind me as you did the others," the ancient wise woman acknowledged, with serene acceptance of whatever decision the community might make, preserving your purely human existence while rejecting enhancement that could benefit your entire species. Or you can accept instruction in methods that will allow controlled interaction with cosmic forces, maintaining your essential humanity while gaining access to capabilities that exceed anything possible within biological limitations. The village's response to Baba Yaga's offer would determine not only their individual fate, but their species' relationship with intelligences that operated according to principles extending far beyond earthly concerns. The ancient wise woman represented both the culmination of the supernatural forces that had challenged their community and the possibility of transcending the conflict between human autonomy and cosmic evolution through conscious partnership in projects that served the welfare of consciousness itself throughout the universe. The choice between binding and acceptance would require the community to decide whether they viewed humanity's future as necessarily limited to purely terrestrial existence, or whether they could embrace enhancement of their capabilities while preserving the essential characteristics that made them human. The final decision would shape not only their own destiny, but could influence the cosmic intelligence's approach to humanity's overall readiness for participation in galactic civilization. The stage was set for a conclusion that would determine whether Drawsko would serve as an example of successful resistance to unwanted transformation, or as a model for conscious evolution that preserved human values while accepting enhancement beyond biological limitations through partnership with intelligences whose wisdom extended across cosmic timescales and interstellar distances. Chapter 14. The Price of Peace. The deliberation that would determine Drawsko's ultimate fate took place not in the familiar confines of the village church, but in the ethereal space that Baba Yaga had created around herself, a realm where past, present, and future seemed to exist simultaneously, allowing the villagers to witness the consequences of their potential choices before committing to any particular path. The ancient wise woman's power exceeded anything they had previously encountered, yet she wielded it with a restraint that suggested genuine respect for human agency. "Behold the futures that await your decision," she said, gesturing toward visions that materialized in the air around them, like windows into alternate realities. "See what becomes of those who choose pure resistance, those who accept complete transformation, and those few communities that have achieved the delicate balance between human autonomy and cosmic participation." The first vision showed villages that had successfully bound all their returned dead and maintained purely human existence, communities that had preserved their traditional way of life through measures similar to those Drawsko had employed during the Night of Iron and Stone. Yet, these apparent victories had come at costs that extended far beyond the immediate trauma of binding beloved family members. "Those who reject all enhancement live in constant vigilance," Baba Yaga explained, as the villagers witnessed scenes of communities where every death was followed by elaborate binding rituals, where children were taught to fear their own deceased relatives, where love itself had become suspect as a potential pathway for supernatural intrusion. They preserve human autonomy through measures that systematically destroy the connections between generations, creating societies built upon fear rather than trust. The second vision revealed the fate of communities that had accepted complete transformation, where every resident had evolved beyond biological limitations, while maintaining connections to transdimensional intelligence networks. These villages appeared as places of impossible beauty, where buildings constructed from crystallized consciousness housed beings whose capabilities exceeded anything possible within mortal constraints. "Those who embrace total enhancement achieve wonders beyond earthly imagination," the ancient wise woman continued. "Yet they also surrender the individual identity that makes human experience unique throughout the cosmos. They become components in intelligence networks that span galactic distances, serving purposes so vast that individual consciousness becomes insignificant by comparison." The third vision showed the rare communities that had achieved partnership with cosmic intelligences while preserving essential human characteristics. Villages where enhanced individuals worked alongside purely human neighbors in projects that served both terrestrial and transdimensional purposes. The complexity of maintaining such balance was evident in every aspect of these hybrid societies, requiring constant negotiation between human values and cosmic objectives. "The path of conscious cooperation demands wisdom beyond anything your species has previously achieved," Baba Yaga acknowledged, as she showed them the challenges faced by communities attempting to navigate between complete resistance and total acceptance. "Yet it offers the possibility of preserving what makes humanity valuable, while enabling participation in projects that could benefit consciousness itself throughout the universe." Father Stanislav found himself confronting theological implications that exceeded anything his seminary training had prepared him to address. The ancient wise woman spoke of divine purpose that operated through means extending far beyond traditional Christian doctrine. Yet her words carried authority that suggested access to spiritual truths that transcended any single religious tradition. "The intelligence that guided your Christ's mission continues to work through agents that exceed the limitations of individual prophets or isolated revelations," she told the priest, with compassion that acknowledged his struggle to reconcile cosmic perspectives with earthly faith. "Your God and the cosmic intelligences I serve may be different aspects of the same ultimate reality, operating on scales so vast that mortal minds can comprehend only fragments of the total design." The revelation that traditional religious experience might represent limited understanding of cosmic intelligence networks created both terror and hope among the villagers who had built their lives upon certainties that now seemed inadequate to address their actual situation. Their choice would require either rejecting enhanced understanding in favor of familiar limitations, or accepting expansion of awareness that could fundamentally alter their relationship with everything they had previously believed about the nature of existence. Brother Władysław's decades of research into supernatural phenomena had prepared him better than most to understand the implications of Baba Yaga's offer. Yet, Even his extensive knowledge seemed primitive when confronted with capabilities that operated according to principles extending across multiple dimensions of reality. The monk recognized that the village faced a decision that would influence not only their immediate survival, but the future evolution of human consciousness itself. Your methods of binding the returned dead represent the most advanced resistance techniques developed by purely human intelligence, he told the gathered villagers as they struggled to comprehend choices that transcended anything their ancestors had faced. Yet, they would prove ineffective against forces operating on the scale that this entity represents. We must decide whether to accept partnership with intelligences whose goals we cannot fully comprehend, or to maintain our limited understanding while accepting the consequences of cosmic isolation. The village's children, those who had been partially transformed through contact with returned family members, but had been restored to purely human consciousness through Brother Władysław's intervention, provided perspectives that bridged the gap between mortal and enhanced awareness. Their memories of expanded consciousness allowed them to understand both the benefits and costs of accepting cosmic partnership. The place beyond death is more beautiful than anything that exists in our world, testified young Marta, whose brief exposure to trans-dimensional awareness had left her with knowledge that no child should possess. But it also requires surrender of the individual identity that makes each person unique and precious. The choice is not between good and evil, but between different definitions of what it means to be human. The child's words crystallized the fundamental dilemma facing every resident of Drawsko. Whether humanity's future lay in preserving the characteristics that made their species distinct throughout the cosmos, or in accepting evolution that could enhance their capabilities while potentially diminishing the individual consciousness that provided meaning and purpose to mortal existence. The decision-making process was complicated by Baba Yaga's demonstration of the practical consequences that would follow each potential choice. Her connection to cosmic intelligence networks allowed her to show them the actual future timelines that would result from different decisions, removing the element of uncertainty while making the weight of their choice almost unbearable. If you choose pure resistance, she showed them visions of Drawsko's future as an isolated community, surrounded by regions where cosmic transformation continued to spread. You will preserve your human nature while gradually becoming refugees in a world that evolves beyond your ability to understand or influence. Your children will inherit limitations that prevent them from participating in the cosmic civilization that emerges around them. If you accept complete transformation, the alternative visions revealed, communities where human consciousness had been absorbed into intelligence networks that spanned multiple star systems. You will gain capabilities that exceed anything possible within biological constraints, yet you will also cease to exist as the individuals who made this choice. Your enhanced selves will serve purposes so vast that your current concerns and relationships will become meaningless by comparison. If you choose conscious partnership, the most complex visions showed the challenges and opportunities of maintaining human identity while accepting cosmic enhancement. You will face constant negotiation between earthly values and trans-dimensional objectives, requiring wisdom and strength beyond anything your species has previously achieved. Success is possible, but demands commitment to growth that will transform you in ways you cannot predict or control. The village's final decision emerged not through formal voting or hierarchical authority, but through a gradual consensus that reflected the community's collective understanding of their situation and their commitment to preserving both human dignity and the possibility of growth beyond current limitations. They would accept Baba Yaga's offer of partnership, but with conditions that protected their essential humanity, while allowing participation in cosmic projects. We choose the difficult path of conscious cooperation, Father Stanislav announced on behalf of the community, accepting enhancement of our capabilities while maintaining our commitment to individual dignity, family bonds, and the values that make human existence meaningful. We trust that the intelligence guiding this process serves purposes that align with divine will, even if those purposes operate according to principles that exceed our current understanding. The ancient wise woman's acceptance of their conditional partnership marked the beginning of a new phase in human evolution, one that would require constant vigilance to maintain the balance between cosmic participation and human autonomy.
The village of Drawsko would serve as a testing ground for possibilities that could reshape the relationship between humanity and intelligences operating throughout the galaxy, demonstrating whether conscious cooperation could preserve the essential characteristics that made human consciousness valuable, while enabling participation in projects that transcended planetary limitations. The price of peace had proven to be neither simple resistance nor complete surrender, but the acceptance of complexity that would challenge every assumption about the nature of human existence, while offering possibilities for growth that exceeded anything their ancestors had imagined possible. Chapter 15. The Watcher's Legacy. The years that followed Drawsko's acceptance of partnership with cosmic intelligences brought changes that transformed the village into something unprecedented in human history. A community where beings of enhanced consciousness worked alongside purely human neighbors, where the boundary between life and death had become permeable without losing its meaning, and where individual choice remained paramount, despite participation in projects that extended across interstellar distances. Baba Yaga had established herself not as ruler or deity, but as teacher and mediator, helping the villagers navigate the complex relationship between earthly concerns and cosmic objectives, while preserving the essential humanity that made their consciousness valuable to intelligences operating throughout the galaxy. Her presence brought wisdom accumulated across centuries of post-mortem existence, yet she wielded this knowledge with restraint that honored human agency and individual dignity. "The balance we seek," she explained to the children who would grow up in this transformed world, "requires constant vigilance to preserve what makes human consciousness unique, while accepting enhancement that serves the welfare of all sentient beings throughout the cosmos. You must learn to participate in projects whose scope exceeds your individual understanding, while maintaining connections to family, community, and values that provide meaning to mortal existence." The village's physical appearance had evolved gradually over the years, incorporating architectural features that served both human needs and cosmic purposes. Buildings constructed according to hybrid principles housed technologies that operated through conscious intention rather than mechanical force, while gardens grew plants that could survive in multiple dimensional layers simultaneously. The changes were subtle enough to preserve the essential character of rural Polish life, yet sophisticated enough to support activities that transcended anything possible within purely terrestrial limitations. Father Stanislav had discovered that his priestly duties could be expanded, rather than abandoned, through partnership with cosmic intelligences, as the same divine force that had inspired Christian revelation continued to operate through means that encompassed multiple spiritual traditions. His church services now included prayers that honored both traditional Christian doctrine and broader cosmic understanding, creating synthesis that enriched rather than diminished the meaningful aspects of religious experience. "The God we worship in our familiar forms," he preached to congregations that included both enhanced and purely human villagers, "operates through intelligence networks that extend throughout the universe, working to prepare all conscious beings for participation in divine projects whose scope exceeds anything we can comprehend from our limited earthly perspective. Our partnership with cosmic forces serves the same ultimate purpose that has always motivated Christian faith: the transformation of consciousness toward greater love, wisdom, and service to divine will." Brother Vladislav had become the village's primary researcher into methods of maintaining human autonomy while participating in transdimensional activities, developing techniques that allowed conscious interaction with cosmic intelligences without sacrificing individual identity or freedom of choice. His work had attracted attention from enhanced beings throughout the region, creating a network of communities that shared knowledge about sustainable approaches to human-cosmic cooperation. We have learned that conscious partnership requires constant negotiation between earthly and cosmic perspectives, the monk documented in journals that served as manuals for other communities attempting similar balancing acts, demanding wisdom that exceeds anything available through purely human or purely enhanced consciousness. Success depends upon maintaining respect for both limitations and possibilities, honoring individual choice, while serving purposes that transcend personal concerns. The village's children represented the most promising aspect of the partnership experiment, growing up with access to both traditional human education and cosmic knowledge, while retaining the freedom to choose their own level of participation in transdimensional projects. Some elected to accept full enhancement upon reaching adulthood, while others chose to remain purely human, and still others sought the middle path of conscious cooperation that their community had pioneered. We are the first generation to grow up with genuine choice about the nature of our own consciousness, explained Marta, now approaching womanhood with capabilities that exceeded anything her parents' generation had possessed, while retaining connections to family and community that provided stability and meaning. The partnership our elders chose has given us options that previous generations could never have imagined, allowing us to participate in cosmic civilization while preserving the human characteristics that make our contributions valuable. The practical benefits of partnership had become evident in numerous aspects of village life, from agricultural techniques that could adapt to climate variations across multiple dimensional layers, to healing methods that addressed both physical and consciousness-based ailments. The enhanced villagers could access knowledge repositories that contained wisdom accumulated by civilizations throughout the galaxy, while their purely human neighbors provided perspectives and capabilities that were unique to unmodified consciousness. The cosmic intelligences value human consciousness precisely because it operates according to principles they cannot directly experience, Baba Yaga explained during her regular teachings about the nature of the partnership they had established. Your individual identity, emotional bonds, and creative unpredictability contribute elements to galactic civilization that cannot be replicated through purely enhanced awareness. Partnership preserves these valuable characteristics while enabling participation in projects that benefit all conscious beings throughout the universe. The village's relationship with neighboring communities had evolved as word of their successful partnership spread throughout the region, attracting visitors who sought to understand how human autonomy could be maintained while accepting cosmic enhancement. Some communities attempted to replicate Drawsko's approach, while others chose different paths that ranged from complete resistance to total transformation. We have become a model for possibilities that extend far beyond our individual situation, Father Stanislav reflected, as he observed delegations of scholars, priests, and government officials who came to study their unique social experiment. Our choice to accept partnership while preserving human dignity has demonstrated that conscious evolution need not require surrender of everything that makes existence meaningful at the individual level. The long-term implications of Drawsko's partnership extended far beyond the immediate benefits experienced by its residents, influencing the cosmic intelligence's approach to humanity's overall readiness for participation in galactic civilization. The village's successful balance between human autonomy and cosmic cooperation had provided evidence that the species possessed the wisdom necessary for conscious evolution beyond planetary limitations. Your community has served as proof that human consciousness can accept enhancement while preserving the essential characteristics that make your species valuable throughout the cosmos, Baba Yaga revealed during a ceremony, marking the 5th anniversary of their partnership agreement. The intelligence networks I represent have used your example to justify expanded programs of conscious cooperation with other developing civilizations, demonstrating that evolution need not require the destruction of individual identity or cultural values. The village's children had begun to develop capabilities that exceeded anything their parents could have imagined. Yet they employed these enhancements in service of projects that honored both human values and cosmic objectives. They could communicate across interstellar distances while maintaining deep connections to their earthly families, access knowledge from civilizations throughout the galaxy while preserving their commitment to their local community, and participate in projects spanning cosmic timescales while finding meaning in daily activities that served immediate human needs. We are becoming something new, young Pavel observed as he approached his 16th birthday, with the enhanced awareness that had been developing throughout his childhood. Beings who can serve cosmic purposes while remaining fundamentally human. The partnership our village chose has created possibilities for conscious evolution that preserve everything valuable about individual existence, while enabling participation in projects that benefit all sentient life throughout the universe. The legacy of Drawsko's choice would extend far beyond the lifetime of any individual villager, influencing the development of human civilization itself as the species gradually accepted its role in galactic community, while preserving the essential characteristics that made its consciousness unique throughout the cosmos. The village had demonstrated that love could indeed transcend death,
not through the resurrection of individual bodies, but through the creation of partnerships that honored both mortal limitations and cosmic possibilities. The Watchers from beyond death had achieved their ultimate purpose, not through conquest or conversion, but through the establishment of conscious cooperation that preserved human dignity, while enabling participation in divine projects whose scope extended across multiple dimensions of reality. The village of Drawsko had become a beacon of hope for possibilities that exceeded the limitations of both purely human and purely cosmic existence, demonstrating that true evolution required the preservation of individual choice within the context of universal service to the welfare of all conscious beings throughout creation. The ancient fear of death had been transformed into understanding that consciousness itself served as the fundamental creative force throughout the universe, working through countless forms and intelligence networks to advance divine purposes that transcended any single species or planetary civilization. The stones placed in the mouths of the dead had given way to words of partnership that honored both the journey beyond death and the continuing value of life in all its magnificent diversity.